The night air over the Green Fork smelled of wet iron and old weeds, a scent that sank into cloth and skin and lingered in the throat. Within his tent Roose Bolton lay still as a slate upon a narrow cot, his eyes open to the linen roof that moved and creaked with each wandering push of the river wind. His maester had brought him leeches in a shallow clay bowl and set them to his pale arms in a careful row, murmuring something about humors and heat, while the lamps hissed and spat. Roose had not answered. He watched the thin creatures swell, the skin about their lips rising a little, like a thinker's brow. Beyond the canvas, men coughed and a horse stamped, chain links rustled. A pot sang once where grease hit flame. He could map the camp by sound without stirring. He had always preferred to learn his rooms in darkness first. There was a letter on the table across from him, the wax already cracked, so that the dire wolf of House Stark lay split across the fold like a carcass opened with too much care. It was not Robb Stark's seal that had yielded under his thumb. The broken wax was red, and the lion that had once sat upon it had been deep and sure. A blow struck by an old man, with a heavy ring and a practiced hand. The maester murmured again and gathered away one leech. Roose turned his face from the ceiling. The man was very young, this maester. He had a boy's mouth and a scholar's hands, and he flinched when Roose's gaze found him, as most men did for the first few months. Roose liked the way men learned to be less afraid. He had found that fear made a kind of courtlier courtesy in them, a slow exactness that kept them from clattering, from shouting, from foolishness. It was better than love, which asked for return and made them speak. "Enough," Roose said. His voice was soft, a whisper in a dead room. The boy took the bowl and scuttled out. Roose rose only when he had the tent again to himself. He moved like a shade, as he had always moved, as his father had taught him, and as his father's father must have done in the corridors beneath the Dreadfort, where even torchlight seemed afraid to catch upon the walls. He crossed to the table, drew the letter near, flattened it with 2 careful fingers, and read once more what he already knew by heart. Lord Bolton, the war's end. Men of sense end them first, and profit most. Lord Walder Frey is a man of sense. You have ever been named such by those who understand the world. The North is a lonely kingdom in winter, and a costly one in all seasons. There is better warmth to be found beside your equals than on your knees to a boy crowned in his mother's grief. When you are ready to be done with grief, there is meat and wine in plenty within my hall, for those who are not blind to the turning of the wheel. Do not be the last hand pulled from under it. It is a cruel thing to be late to wisdom. Lord Tywin Lannister. Roose's eyes lingered upon the last line, not because it pleased or displeased him, but because he liked the size of the strokes, the consistent weight of them. Whatever else the old lion might be, he did not wobble. Walder Frey had written to him also, but Frey's letters were greasy things, blots, self-important dashes, and a kind of wheedling flourish at the end, like a belch someone had attempted to curtsy through. Tywin Lannister's words rode straight and sure, and did not pretend to be other than they were. Roose ran the tip of his index finger along the parchment's edge, and called to mind the runes of the Dreadfort. He had walked them in darkness 1,000 times, counting doorways with his palm, putting his weight upon each step, and feeling for the stone that yielded, for the crack that answered. You did not keep a castle by trusting the stairs. You kept it by being faithful to its dark. The Starks had kept theirs by believing it had a soul. Both methods worked. One cost more blood, those who were not blind to the turning of the wheel. He thought of his leeches, lined like a little counsel along his arm, and of his father, pale as new milk, voice soft, eyes empty, so that every word sounded carefully measured between cold fingers. House Bolton had endured, and not only by flaying. The flaying was a story men told when they wished to feel they understood a thing. The truth was quieter. The truth was that Boltons wore other men's weather. They did not ask the sky to change for them. In the North, that often meant a direwolf shadow over their flayed man, and there were worse shadows. There was an iron crown to the south that had broken as many necks as it had crowned heads. He folded the letter and held it above the lamp until its edge browned and blazed. The wax melted first, smearing into a tired red tear. The parchment went last, reluctant as old bark, and when it shrank into itself and collapsed, He pinched the last ember dead, rubbed it to nothing, and wiped his fingers clean upon a square of cloth. He did not ring for his maester. He did not need a witness to the decision he had made. When Roose Bolton had sworn service to Eddard Stark, he had done so with the words he had always used to bind himself. The smallest that would do, and the most exact. When Robb Stark called the banners, it had been too late to unmake such knots at speed without tearing the fabric they held, and Roose disliked torn things beyond their being useless. He had watched Robb's face sober under the crown, the eyes hardening in ways that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with weight. He had considered the boy's mother, whose grief was too clean to be a tool. He had tested the air of every hall they had passed through, and none of the airs had smelled of him more than of wolves. Bolton men, under Lannister banners, would be stranger meat than salmon in winter. He would keep faith for as long as faith kept the north, and he would make the keeping look fatter than it was. He blew out the smaller lamp, took up the heavier cloak from the peg, and stepped into his boots. Outside the tent, the river shone like dull pewter, under a sky eaten to bone by thin clouds. The guardsmen at his door straightened as he passed. Their movements were careful men's movements, aching and deliberate from days of rain. He liked them that way. Across the camp, the king in the north slept. If he slept. Caitlin Stark did not. Roose would have wagered a hand. Women like her learned to listen to emptiness as if it were a cradle's breath. He kept to the darker corners of the camp and its little orderings. The pickets where a boy held 3 horses with both hands and both arms. The fire that was too large for sense and meant either a drunk or an argument. The half-mended wheel. The gray dog. The sentries challenged him and were satisfied. He came at last to the king's pavilion where the guards wore the king's badge and the king's attention. "I would see Robb Stark," he said. "No." He did not raise his voice, but they heard the now and admitted him. Caitlin Stark was indeed awake. She stood near the lamp with a cloak thrown over a simple gown, her hair unbound and her face clear of tears, as if she had not had to remake it. Robb Stark sat at the table with a cup of something that steamed upon his palm. At the sound of Roose's step, Grey Wind lifted his head from the floor and bared his teeth. The boy king reached to lay his free hand upon the direwolf's neck, and the lip fell. "My Lord Bolton," Robb said. He was using the voice he had learned from his father. Soft for what could be soft, iron when it must. The sound of it would become a habit in time. "You might have sent word. Some words are better when delivered with their breath still warm," Roose said. "Your Grace." Caitlin Stark lowered her eyes as if to humble the queen she had never wanted to be. "What news?" Roose went to the table and placed his hands upon the smooth wood. He did not sit. "Lord Walder Frey will receive us for the wedding. He has sent assurances of amity and requires the proper courtesies. He counts courtesies carefully." "And?" Robb asked. "And Tywin Lannister counts them closer yet. There is ink between the twins and the rock. There's been for longer than suits our stomachs. The smell of it is old. It draws flies." Caitlin Stark's hand tightened on her cloak. "You have letters." "I had. I preferred flame to paper." He inclined his head toward the cup in Robb's hand. "You need not drink now, Your Grace. We will drink enough soon. The crossing will be bought with apologies and meat. The price after will not be named, but it will be measured in blood if we are dull." "Then no one." Robb Stark held Roose's gaze for a long moment, and Roose saw Eddard Stark's winter in the boy's eyes for the first time. It was not a coldness that delighted in the cold. It was cold's acceptance as a language of duty. "You believe Lord Walder Frey intends harm under guest right?" "I believe Lord Walder Frey believes in the price a thing will bring. He gives nothing that he cannot count, and he counts more than bread and salt. If Lord Tywin has promised him room for his pride, we must give him a room with a better view, or he will sell us the roof. If he has promised Frey safety from our anger after betrayal, we must give Frey fear enough to make him doubt the guarantee." "Ben?" Caitlin Stark said. "And how does one frighten a man who believes he has an old lion's shield above him? By showing him that the lion's shield is far away and the wolf's teeth are in the room," Roose said. He let the smallest breath of something like amusement slip into his voice. "And by ensuring that when the shield is late, the room is already full of men who prefer not to die." Robb set down his cup. "Tell me what you propose." Roose spoke softly, and the candle took his words as if it wished to keep them. We go to the twins as promised, and we go with courtesy. We allow Lord Edmure Tully his bedding, and give Lord Walder every bow he has waited for. We enter under guest right, and we keep it. We will do nothing that frees Lord Walder to believe himself the corrector of others' breaches. But we will not go naked. Your guard will wear mail beneath their wedding coats and carry knives in their sleeves. My own men will rotate service as cupbearers and musicians. You will be surprised how many know a tune. Lady Mage Mormont's women have good ears. They will be stationed near the doors. We will encourage Lord Walder to keep Grey Wind outside for his own peace, but we will not insist when you resist his preference. Men who mean no harm to a king do not fear a king's shadow. Damn. Caitlin Stark's mouth twisted, not with spite but with a memory. Walder Frey will not like to be told what songs he may forbid. He may forbid what he likes, Roose said. We will hear what is played. Robb nodded once. And if we see what you fear, then we make the evening a lesson in how difficult it is to kill a king who does not wish to die, Roose said. And how expensive. We turn the tables and cut ourselves a passage out. Through the hall if that is the line they mean to take, or through the yard if they intend to pen us. We will not drink as if we are home. Ben Nawanda. Caitlin watched him, as a hawk watches a field. You have counted where every blade will stand. Counting is cheaper than bleeding, Roose said. And both are cheaper than trusting a man who has named all his grandsons to remind himself that he may be immortal if he breathes fast enough. Robb's hand returned to Grey Wind's neck. The dire wolf had set his head on his paws, but his eyes shone as if the light from the candle had found and made a home there. Very well, the boy said. We go with our eyes open. Lord Bolton, you have my thanks. Roose inclined his head. Your thanks will buy nothing at the twins. Your caution will. He left them and felt the room's warmth step back from his back. In the corridor he came almost at once upon Brynden Tully, who had the look of a man who could fall asleep with his eyes open and wake to argue while still snoring. The Blackfish folded his arms and cocked his head. I never liked your face, Brynden said, as cordial in his fashion as any man would be with a prayer on his lips. It is a quiet treason, that face. Roose did not object. Some treasons are louder, sir. Ay, Brynden said softly. Some ring with silver. He looked past Roose's shoulder toward the king's pavilion. You have told him to go to the twins with steel under his songs. Good. I will have the archers keep their strings dry. Freys are like reeds that dream of being spears. You put enough pressure on them and they'll split along their own weakness. Bam? Roose lowered his eyes in lieu of a smile. Your archers will not loose except on my signal. If Lord Walder means only to frighten the king, he will be satisfied with a tremor that does not reach his toes. If he means worse, he will have the tremor and the fall together. Be patient. Patient I can be, Brynden said. Patient and mean. It is an old Riverlands trick. He stepped aside so that Roose could pass. Tell your cupbearers this. No hand empties a flagon but to fill a northern throat he knows by name. Roose did not turn. They know their friends. I chose men who have few. He returned to his own tent and sat again on the narrow cot. The leech bowl was gone, the lamps recut, the canvas walls whispering. He remembered a boy's face, pale and hungry-eyed, who had pulled a woman into a ruined tower because she had flattered his father's men with bread and petty coin. He remembered the letter that had come after like a wound disguised as a bandage. Roose had written back with the exact words required to keep the bastard both used and at a distance, and then kept them in a place where words were more than breath. Ramsay Snow wore a man's carcass over a dog's hunger, and liked to let it slip to show the teeth beneath. He would be a useful dog while the leash held. The leash must hold. He took out quill and parchment and wrote 3 letters that night. One went north to Winterfell, what was left of it, or what might be retrieved of it with time and care. Addressed to the castellan he had appointed in the absence of any certain Stark. Hold everything, he wrote. Keep the stores hidden. Do not trust men who boast of trusting. Ramsay Snow is not to take men out without countersigned order from me. If he asks, he's to be told, a raven has fled slow. Bleed him with patience. The second went to White Harbor, to Lord Wyman Manderley, whose body was a map of his appetites and whose mind was a better ledger than his kitchen cap. Wyman was as careful a friend as a man could ask who wanted his friend to pretend to be a fool. Roose asked for Hightower candles, of all things, and for salted eels by the barrel. Wyman would read it once and laugh, and then read it again. Softer, and see that Roose wished a cask of men who could pass as meaty dockhands and had their fingers used to knives. He did not name what the knives were for. He signed himself as ever, exact, and spare, and added a postscript that made reference to Wendell Manderley's too hearty love of Frey wine. Wyman would feel the little sting. Stings did more to wake whales than horns did. The third letter was shorter than both, and carried only to Barrington. Lady Barbary Dustin had the look of a woman who had made every ruin in her life do 2 seasons more service than it wished. Roose liked her in the way he liked thrift. He wrote what courtesy required, and then he wrote what truth attended to. Hold the barrow lands with mercy that looks like iron. Feed 2 men in public, for every 10 you starve in private, and make account of the hungry, so that the number is a song. The small folk know. Sing it to them. She would understand. Mercy was a tool. The shape of it must suit the hand that held it. He sent the letters at once with men of his own, swore them on old gods and newer knives, and then lay back until the world thinned about him to the narrow pale place he preferred to sleep. He dreamt, if he dreamt, of snow falling into a mouth that did not close. When they rode for the twins 2 days later, the Green Fork was a brown, swollen length of misery, and the fields about it were pocked with shallow lakes, where bootsuck and hoof-gouge had filled with the rain. The banners made a ragged, damp procession. Direwolf and trout, and flayed man and merman and bear, tilting and straightening, and then tilting again with each gust, as if the wind were a slow, patient opponent, pushing at their chests. The Freys had sent word of welcomes, and had dressed their towers with their herd of small blue and gray squares, and their faces in 100 copies of the same old man. Narrow-lipped, narrow-eyed, with a miserliness that had grown past money to manners and breath. Roose rode near the front to measure the posture of the ground and the posture of the hosts that watched them from the walls. He liked walls. Men built walls for 2 reasons: to keep the world from seeing what was inside, or to keep what was inside from seeing the world. The twins had the look of a place that did not trust either side overmuch. He noted the number of archers peering down, the way their shoulders sat beneath their jerkins, the wetness of their bowstrings. He noted the groups of men loitering just inside the sally ports with their hands too carefully out of sight. At the gates, Lord Ryman Frey made a show of gallantry, like a man rummaging through a chest for an old cloak that might still pass as handsome. He bowed to Robb Stark with stiff correctness, kissed Catelyn Stark's knuckles as if they were a sour fruit he was bound by prayer to suck, and made no effort to hide the way his eyes slid to Roose's face and skittered away. Behind him, Black Walder Rivers stood as a man stands when he has been told to look like a wall. His mouth looked like it wished to spit and had been taught to swallow. Bread and salt were offered. There were too many hands about the trenchers, too many eyes upon the salt. Robb broke the bread slowly and took the pinch with care. Catelyn took hers in silence, and holding Roose's gaze for an instant that was both accusation and alliance. A mother's you had better be right, which is close kin to a soldier's I hope you are. Roose took bread last, and used the same fingers that had pinched Tywin's ember dead. Lord Walder Frey himself received them in the great hall like a sparrow on a stolen throne. He had on him a gown of dark cloth that had once been fine enough to be named aloud, and a cloak that had been meant for a better back. His beard gathered spittle as he smiled. The handsome child beside him, Rosalind the bride, looked as if she had been sewn hastily into her own fear, and could not find the seam to cut herself free. King in the north, Walder said, and it was not a greeting so much as a curiosity. King, king, king. It comes off the tongue like a burr. I ought to charge rent for each step the word takes upon my floor. And Lady Catelyn, not. You look well for a woman whose son dropped my granddaughter in a ditch and rolled another in her place. Lord Walder, Cailin said, with a bow that was as exact as an archer's draw. "Words," Walder continued, and gestured with his long fingers as if flinging them in handfuls at the walls. "Words. I have eaten more words than bread. I have. And less of it stayed on my ribs. Well, well. You are here. That is something. My son is to have a Tully wife after all." "Nah." Roslin, curtsy. "Child, you have legs. Banan. Damnyor." Roslin curtsied and blinked tears back so fiercely that Roose thought she might swallow one in public. They took their seats and their cups, and a troupe of musicians assembled in the shadows by the far hearth. The hall's air was thick with roasting meat and men's breath, and the damp that never left the river's children, even by firelight. Roose watched the strong men serving the weaker wine, the young men serving the strong. He watched the doors. He watched the high window that had been opened a hand's width to let out the smell of onions, and let in rather more than that. He watched Lord Walder's youngest boys slip in and out like ferrets. He watched the way Black Walder's shoulders rose each time Grey Wind shifted under the table at Rob's right. Lord Edmure Tully entered at last with his bride's hand in his, and the roar of the room took on the false, generous quality of men who want to sell happiness to those already spent. Edmure was flushed with nerves, with wine, with having been forgiven for the thing that could never be forgiven, because it had never truly been a sin. The defense of his own river. He attempted a jape and strangled it, and the laughter came anyway. When he kissed his bride, the room made a noise like a door being eased open in winter, so that no heat would be lost. Walder Frey's mouth made a thing like a smile, but the eyes above it were counting. The feast began in earnest, and Roose began the long, patient labor of those who intend to outlast another man's intent. He changed cups twice at the first course, passing one to a Mormont woman with a look that would have looked like a flirtation to any man who had never been to Bear Island. She drank a thumb's worth and raised her brow 2 hairs, and the cup went aside to a Glover man who would not still be there in the morning if Roose had miscounted. He spoke to the cupbearer, a sign to him of the river's habits and flood, and learned from the boy that the men in the West Tower had been relieved at odd hours all day, as if they were being shifted around for a game they had not played before. He ate bread with 2 fingers. He let one of the Cranagmen of House Reed in Northern Service stand suddenly from the bench behind him and scratch his shoulder with the hand that was not tucked into his sleeve. Cailin moved like a mother between tables, speaking low and touching hands, letting eyes be set upon her, so that the attention was turned from the door to the Queen Mother. Rob laughed twice where laughter was asked for, and smiled 4 times where smiles were counted. And when Grey Wind bared his teeth at a passing Frey lad who had thought to test his courage with a heel, the boy went white as milk, and Walder lifted his fingers in a perfumed gesture that meant nothing and less than nothing. Roose felt the moment when the song changed. It was not a sound one heard with the ears. It was a pressure, the way the air in a room knows when a heavy door is about to shut. There was a small misplacement of attention among the players, and then a marvelous unison, as if the mistake had been a held breath, and now the lungs had decided to accept air again. The tune itself did not announce itself with trumpets. It walked with its own certainty from the back of the hall like a man who knows what rooms he owns. The first notes of "The Rains of Castamere" rang their thin bell upon the trestles and the meat and the cups. Cailin heard it first. He saw the tightening in her mouth, the stilling of her hand upon the rim of a flagon. Rob had heard it before his mother. His knuckles whitened against Grey Wind's pelt, a childish gesture transformed by the animal it lay upon into a king's restraint. Brynden Tully, at the far table, made a show of complaining to a squire about overdone beef, and put his fingers to the inside of his elbow as if irritated. The archer behind him, reading the sign, rubbed at his nose. Roose let his shoulders relax a measure. He took up his cup and held it in his left hand, and with his right, under the lip of the table, touched 2 fingers to the knife hidden there, not to draw it, not to be theatrical about it, but to let his own men see a small movement that would ripple down the row. He saw, 4 tables off, a man in the livery of House Serwyn stand and stumble, catching himself upon the back of a chair as if the wine had tripped him. The movement put him within reach of the sconce. He adjusted the candle as if to spare the hall smoke, and in doing so occluded for a heartbeat the line of sight of 3 men upon the western gallery. It is the small things that make a world break clean and not jagged. Walder Frey rose. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when the old must be waited for. He rapped the table with his fingers and rolled a word around in his mouth, as if tasting a sweet that might be a stone. "It is time," he said, wheezing the syllables as if they were a friend's joke. "It is time for bedding." Men roared. Women shrieked as women do when they are ready to be shrieked at, because the shriek is part of the game. Robb came to his feet with them, and Grey Wind surged up like a gray wave and pressed the king's thighs, so that he had to use his hand to steady the animal's great head. Cailin stood too, and her fingers worried at the laces of her sleeve, as if she had not chosen whether she would be mother or bannerman. Roose rose last, as he always did, to measure how quickly others wished to get to the ground again. The bedding party formed itself, disorderly and exact, under the musicians' grin. Men jostled one another for position near Rosalind Frey and near Lord Edmure Tully, and already there were japes about seeing if the Tully trout could swim a properly northern river. Arms reached, there were hands upon the bride's sleeve, and Rosalind's laugh was as strained as a neck stretched to a prayer. The song took on a lark's speed, the players tripping many notes to disguise the one they all meant, and Roose saw the first bow drawn up by the west window, the man's shoulder lifting a fraction, and then pausing there as if a great bird hung upon the muscle to rest. Bolton men do not shout. That is a thing the North knows. The flaying man does not cry out when he comes for you, and his master does not call his name. Roose did not shout. He moved his right hand under the table, touched his knife once, twice, and the movements went outward, through the men who watched his hands, and then the men who watched theirs. A boy by the door fell to his knees as if drunk and sent a platter clattering hard against the rushes. The noise turned a dozen heads with the instinct bred of long campaigns. In that turning, an archer on the east gallery found that his elbow knocked the bow of the man beside him, so that the string sang before it had intended to, and the arrow that would have sought a king's chest sought instead a carved beam of the twins, and made there a small surprised shiver. The room took a breath. A Frey shouted something raw, a syllable that might have been the beginning of a prayer or a curse, and half the hands that had been set to touch a bride took half steps toward their belts. Roose put his left palm upon the table and stood very straight. "Now," he said to the world, and afterward men would swear they had never heard him speak louder. "Now." The thing that happened in the hall did not look at first like a battle. It looked like a house settling wrong. The Mormont women moved first, not fast but sure, like chairs being pushed back altogether. One drove her elbow into a Frey throat, another broke a wrist that had reached for a knife. Grey Wind leapt, and a man's scream stitched the air without finishing its seam. Brynden Tully half spun, and the archer behind him, who had been picking at his nose, produced from his sleeve a knife that had not been there a heartbeat before, and opened the belly of the man reaching for his own bow. Roose lifted his cup, as if to drink, and flung the wine with his left hand into the eyes of the nearest man on the dais, and with his right hand he at last drew the knife he had been in no hurry to touch, and planted it in the table so that it stood, a small flag, to mark his place in the world. Robb Stark's sword came free with an old music. He stepped toward his mother and dragged her behind the table, and Grey Wind went before him as a door goes before a lord. Caitlin's hand had found a knife. Where had she taken it from? Roose wondered briefly, remembering that love is a great thief, and she sliced through the laces of her sleeve as if there were something in them that bound her breath. Men were falling in a dozen different ways, which is how a room dies when it does not know yet that it was meant to. Some clutched at bellies, some at throats, some sat down with astonished faces like scholars who have at last misunderstood a theorem they had always felt certain about. Walder Frey did not move. His mouth had fallen open in a sneer that had meant to be a smile, and for the first time Roose saw that the old man would look afraid only when fear was as nameless as sleep. Black Walder Rivers had his sword half out, and then all out, and then he was parrying Brynden Tully, and then he was not. He was looking with horror at the blood upon the floor, as if its quantity offended him in some private way. Ryman Frey bellowed, and the bellow ended with a sound like the last spoon taken out of a pot and flung down. Arrows came, but not in the way they had been counted upon by their masters. Some were loosed blind in fury. Some were loosed sure and met sure answers. The candle at the sconce that had been adjusted at Roose's little sign guttered out under the rush of air from a fray boy's boot, and in that darkened wedge a column of men in the livery of House Glover flowed to cut a path to the nearest door. They took 2 steps, 3, a 4th, and then the door itself moved as if unwilling to be opened for them, because the men behind it had been set there to hold it, and were now set there to flee from what they had not been told would be an answer. "Out the yard," Roose said, and men heard him because he suggested rather than begged, and because the tone in his mouth had the sound of a small knife being returned to its sheath. He angled his body toward the smaller door to the kitchens, and men took the signal for a plan already made. The Mormont women fell back in good order, their knives in their sleeves again, their hands appearing once more as hands that carried platters. Cailin moved with them, her hair loose now and her face full of the thing that comes when a mother has decided that her love will have hands. Robb kept Grey Wind close and his sword closer, and Brynden Tully laughed once, short, a sound like a stone being thrown into a river to test its depth, and then began to walk through the men who still stood as if they were only the shadows of their own bodies. They spilled from the hall, not as cravens, but as men who had remembered that corridors are weapons too. The smells there were different: fat, boiled bone, wet ash, and the light was worse, and Roose liked it more. He took the lead because he knew the width of rooms by their silence, and the strength of doors by the sounds they made when other men touched them. He sent 2 men ahead who had been butchers in peace, and were butchers still. He left a Glover at the turn where the stair went up to the east gallery, with orders to let 3 men pass before he took the 4th with the heel of his hand. He sent a Reed Cranagman to the yard to stir the horses. He counted. Counting was the only prayer he honored. They met little resistance in the kitchen, because kitchens belong to cooks, and cooks have no patience for swords while the stock is on. A fleshy woman with a hand like a shovel tried to bar their path with a ladle, and when she saw the king and the wolf, she cried out, and that opened a path wider than any threat would have accomplished. Outside the kitchen door, the yard took them with a wet slap. Rain found faces that had been flushed with heat. The night had arranged itself in a pattern of torches and blackness. That was no natural thing. Roose could feel the way men had meant to see and be seen, and he adjusted to it, moving toward the places where the light was worst and the rain best. "Northgate," he said softly. "If their plan is to pen us, their plan is made by rivermen. They will have overweighted their southern nets. We go where they are sparser, and where there is more mud." Cailin was breathing through her nose as if she had been running for days. "We cannot abandon Edmure," she said. "We would not," Roose answered. "We go fetch him." He set men then like stones in a river to adjust the current. Meg Mormont took 6 and vanished without a sound into the rain. She would find Rosalind Frey before most men found a torch. Brynden Tully snarled, and took 9 like a small troop of hounds. Roose kept the king near, and spread Glover men thin, to be walls between torches. Twice they diverted when shouts rose, once because a knot of Freys were attempting to drive a wedge through the yard like a farmer setting his oxen, once because a door had opened unexpectedly and vomited soldiers and a boy with hair like a broom. And twice they let arrows pass them, the shafts walking the mud where they had been because the men who loosed them had not accounted for rain. When they reached the north gate, it was not yet barred because the men set to fetch more men to bar it were still arguing about who should be brave. Roose did not dignify them with answers. He cut. It had been some time since he had had to do such work with his own hands, and he was reminded all at once that it is one thing to be accurate with words and another to be accurate with steel. He did not say anything while he worked. Words are wasted on men who are losing blood. He saved his for later. Behind them the hall had come into its own plan. Shouts braided together and then unbraided. The song had stopped as if a hand had closed around a throat. The bedding party had dissolved not into wedding, but into 100 men's memories of other nights, where knives had been nearer, and laughter had been worse. Roose did not look back more than once, long enough to see Lord Walder Frey standing upon the dais with his mouth still open, and his fingers at last trembling, and he thought, "So this is what you look like when it does not go the way you counted it." He found the picture instructive in a way he hoped to remember until winter swallowed even him. They spilled through the north gate, a tide that had decided not to be commanded. Horses screamed, pulled fast, recognized men by scent, and then stilled. Gray wind moved from foot to hoof, with a grace that animals remember before men do. Robb swung to the saddle with a stiffness that made Roose think of all the days the boy had been king, and all the nights he had not been allowed to be a lad. Cailin mounted without help. Brynden Tully came last of those who would go first and nodded once, grimly, as to an equal whose reluctance to speak matched his own. "Edmure," Cailin said again, but now with a different thread in it. There was steel there, a line she meant to draw across the dark. Roose turned his horse's head toward the east tower. "There," he said, "Lord Edmure Tully is a fish. He will have been stowed where water cannot easily reach him. We go up." He signaled, and men fell in behind him because they had realized in the last half hour that he told the truth when the truth was all there was left to spend. They made a wedge and took the base of the tower as if it had always been theirs. The stair was a throat, and they went down it as much as up. Men fought in such places like sleepers waking to a cry, swinging with their arms before their minds were fully present, and Roose stepped past several such dreams and let others in his company finish them. When they reached the high room that stank of straw and the last winter's piss, they found Edmure Tully not yet stripped to nakedness as he might have been, if Walder Frey had been given another hour to show what he thought of guest right, but already half undressed and confused and crying with anger. Rosalind Frey stood in the corner with her hands to her chest and her mouth open upon a sound that would not come. Brynden Tully went to Rosalind first and put his hand upon her elbow, as if she were one of his young hounds after all. And she let herself be led, because there was a purpose in the man's touch that was better than the fear that had been her purpose before. Edmure began to bluster, to sob, to swear that he would make the walls remember the Tullys, and Cailin went to him and put her hand flat upon his mouth and looked him level. "Hush," she said. "You will come home." Roose stood at the window and looked down into the yard. The rain had thickened to fat ropes, and the torches guttered, and the men who had meant to hold a triumph found themselves holding water that would not be held. Lines were forming for a pursuit toward the south gate. He smiled very slightly. Pursuit. All. The river was in flood, and the Freys were laying themselves out like driftwood to be caught upon their own posts. "Now," Roose said a second time, and the word went down the stair before him. They made their passage back as a bar of iron is drawn out of a forge, straight and slow, because the men who hold the tongs do not wish to break it. At the north gate again he set two of his own with oil and flint, and in moments the half-rotten timbers were coughing out a smoke that would go to the rafters and throttle the sightlines Frey archers had prayed for. They did not linger. When they had their horses beneath them and the king in their center, Roose turned his mount's head one last time toward the hall, and saw in the high window Walder Frey, with his hands upon the ledge and his mouth full of a child's bewilderment, where a miser's offense had been expected. Roose offered him the courtesy of a nod. The old man did not see it. They rode into the rain and the dark and the river noise. Not a rout but a withdrawal that would be taught later to boys with swords as a thing that may be done if a man has counted properly, and if fortune agrees to count as well. The green fork took the thunder of hooves like a drumskin worked by a patient hand. Behind them, the song ended at last, and another began that no one there would ever write down. They did not speak until the towers had become odd shapes against a sky that was making up its mind to be morning. The horses steamed. The men did not. Robb's face had lost the heat of the hall, and held only the weight he had taken there and brought away. Cailin rode beside him, with her hair clinging to her wet cheeks in ropes like set strings. At the crest of a muddy rise they halted. The army, such as it was in that hour, drew up behind them and breathed. Damp men watched damp banners stir. The river breathed too, heavy and pleased that it had been allowed to play a part. Brynden Tully wiped his knife clean on a scrap of someone's fine cloth, watched the stain spread, and tucked the blade away. Robb Stark turned his head and met Roose Bolton's pale eyes. There was a question there, no flattery. "You were right," he said simply. "I usually am," Roose answered. And he said it with the same softness that he had said now in the hall, because loudness would have broken something that did not need to be broken. He straightened in the saddle. "We will move north at once. Lord Wyman Manderley will send us what we require at White Harbor. If ravens do not freeze in their flight, we will hold Moat Cailin, and we will make the Neck a winter no southerner has ever survived. Lord Walder Frey will pretend he has won because he survived his own courage. Lord Tywin Lannister will count again and find that what he counted upon died wet. Now," Caitlin breathed out like a woman who has heard a priest admit that the gods have no stronger prayer than patience. "And the Riverlands?" she asked. "We will not abandon them," Roose said. "We will bleed for them later rather than now. Blood is best spent when the men who spill it have had their sleep." He looked to the west, where the clouds were a little paler, as if someone had rubbed a thumb there. "The Freys will make a song about this night and pretend it was theirs from the beginning. Let them. Songs are cheaper than soldiers." "Bendarawantur." Robb nodded slowly. He lifted his hand and laid it in the wet gray fur at Grey Wind's neck, and the direwolf leaned into the touch, not for reassurance, but as if to remind the boy that two living things can share weight without either stumbling. The men behind them began to move again when Roose moved, because that is what men do in rain, when they trust the man who has not let them freeze. The horses' hooves made a new music upon the road north, and the world closed behind them like a door whose hinges have been given oil at last. Behind, in the twins, Walder Frey would count and curse, and try to gather his torn pride into a garment that would keep out the cold. Tywin Lannister would sit under candles and weigh letters like coins and decide where to spend his next lie. In the Dreadfort, the leech bowl would be emptied and washed, and placed back upon the shelf where such things sit and wait for other men's wars. Roose Bolton rode without hurry, eyes pale and steady upon the line where sky met land. And if he prayed, no man could hear to which god it was said. In White Harbor that same gray morning, Lord Wyman Manderley broke his fast over a platter large enough to drown 3 suppers and read twice the short letter that had arrived on damp wings before dawn. His daughter-in-law, known for choosing the cream in anything, asked him whether there would be a feast for the bride at the twins. He patted her hand and told her that feasts had a way of making their own reckonings, and then sent for men who knew that knives work just as well in fog. He ordered salted eels by the barrel for a winter that would make men grateful for any meat that did not taste of their own stories. "The North remembers," he told the empty hall after the servants had left, and his voice was not so much a boast as a statement of inventory. At the Dreadfort, a raven came with Roose's words and maesters. Ribbon and Ramsay Snow's mouth grew a smile that had too many teeth in it for its size. "Hold," he said to the old Castellan who had known Roose since he was smoother and colder than any stone. "Hold?" Ramsay laughed then, and the sound made the dogs in the yard sit and look at the sky. "We will hold," he said, and turned away with a leisurely malice. The old Castellan watched him go with the patience of a thorn bush that has learned the difference between sheep and wolves, and knows it must scratch both with the same energy. North the road climbed toward Moat Cailin, toward the bog, and the reeds and the green dreams of Howland Reed's children, toward a bottleneck that had swallowed 100 southern ambitions and would be asked to swallow more. Roose Bolton's mind moved as quietly as his horse, ahead of itself and behind, measuring the weight of banners and the strength of laces, counting every door and every piece of bread. He kept a hand upon what he had chosen with the same looseness he might have used to steady a falcon. Sometimes a thing flew better for being allowed to think it was free. Sometimes a house survived not by being loved, but by giving no one reason to hate it today. Robb Stark spoke once more as they rode, his voice low so that it would reach only those who were meant to hear. "There will be a reckoning, my lord," he said. "I will not let this be remembered as the night a wolf went to a feast and crept away." Roose inclined his head. "There will be a reckoning," he agreed. "But it will be ours." He did not look back again. The rain lessened. The banners shook themselves like wet dogs. The North, which had always been there under the mud and the worry, lifted its head as if at last it had scented the weather it had been promised. Somewhere far behind them a song was being made that would be broken before it reached the second verse. Ahead, The neck waited with its secrets and its waters. And beyond that, the winter that would scrape away all paint to see what the wood beneath was truly like. Roose Bolton intended that when the scraping ended, his house would still hold shape. He had chosen his weather. He would wear it until it wore thin, and then he would take up a needle and repair the hems while other men slept. The road north unrolled in slow, rutted lengths, and the sky wore the same color as old pewter for 3 days together, so that men began to wonder if the world had only ever been this one shade, and they had foolishly remembered others. The king in the north rode with his mother and his wolf, not at the van because Roose Bolton kept his lightest feet there, but never far from it. A king who lets the weather take the first arrow for him lives longer, Roose thought. The boy had learned much since he put a crown upon grief. They did not string themselves on a single cord of men, but traveled in 3 bodies that touched and parted and touched again as the land demanded, carts and wounded, and mothers of small boys in the center. Men who preferred the sound of leather creak to any song on the edges. The North goes best when it goes as a hunt, rather than a parade. Brynden Tully agreed with that, and said as much with his mouth full of a stale oatcake that he seemed to have been eating for a week. He rode the windward flank with a thin smile, and eyes that missed neither puddle nor man. Edmure Tully had stopped trying to find japes that would make his new wife smile. Rosalind rode between 2 Mormont women with her hands clenched in her lap, like someone trying to hold a bird still under her palms. Cailin Stark gave her small kindnesses that they could afford. A cloak pulled closer, the last of a honeyed fig, the sort of talk that keeps a mind occupied with the weight of the next hour, and not the shape of the one before it. Edmure had flared into anger twice at his own uselessness, and then flamed out into shame like cheap pitch. On the 3rd day he began to ask questions about bridges, fords, old wells. On the 4th he stopped asking, and began counting silently, which is better. Roose slept little, and dreamed not at all or else too much. At dusk he sent men into the hedges to listen, return, and say nothing until the last fire had found its shape. At dawn he had the van mount into the fog, and match their pace to the fog's slow thought. If the Freys meant to pursue with any appetite, they would do it with noise they could not help making. If Lannisters meant to reach long from the west, their hand would show itself as dust. He saw neither dust nor appetite, only small parties of horse that came close enough to see the grey wolf shadowing the king, and then remembered a prayer and cantered away. On the 5th day, a heron led them to the mouth of the neck, rising from a brown ditch with a long, indolent stoop, and then vanishing into vapors that had the scent of rotting leaves and cold iron together. The land changed there in a way even men's bones felt. The borders of things softened. Distances gathered tricks. The road became less a line and more a suggestion. Men who had spent their years on stone and plowland shifted in their saddles, and let their mouths fall open to taste the air, the way hounds do when they are near a beast they have never hunted before. Moat Cailin, Brynden Tully said, as if naming an old adversary he respected. Ugly old bastard. Useful old bastard, Roose answered. He looked where the land was least definite. We will make it more useful yet. They halted in the shadows of first reeds. Ravens were loosed. A camp went up that looked like chance at a glance, and like ritual, when you counted how each tent's entrance faced the next. There were no great fires. Men learned to relish food that had never seen a flame. At night, one could hear something moving somewhere that did not wear boots. The Mormont women gave it a name in their own tongue, and did not repeat it. Near sunset on the 6th day, a small boat came out of the mist, where no water seemed deep enough to hold one. It made no sound except the drip of its own passing, and then the drip stopped, and the boat was simply there at the edge of the bank. A man stood in it who might have been younger than Robb or older than Roose, depending on whether you counted years by winters or by enemies buried. Howland Reed had eyes the color of a frog's pool, and a mouth that remembered the taste of oaths. He lifted one hand, palm out. A hunter's greeting to a fellow who has chosen the same silence. Lord Reed, Robb said, dismounting. You came. Your ravens did, Howland answered, stepping lightly to land. His voice was low and had the same grain as the fog. They do not lose their way to Greywater Watch so long as they are asked and not told. This is a poor land for orders. Roose watched the man as any man watches another, he would rather have as a neighbor than an occupant. Northmen told stories of the Cranagmen, stories that made them less than men or more, as a way of admitting that they were only different. The difference pleased Roose. He preferred tools that had not been dulled by the same old work. "We will want to pass men and wagons north," he said. "We will want to hold south. And we will want to pluck thorns from the causeway that the Ironborn have pushed into our flesh." Howland Reed's gaze slid to Robb, and then back to Roose like a thin fish turning in brown water. "You will want to do all of this without paying a price you cannot pay twice. A king with no second coin is only a wish." He lifted 2 fingers as if to count reed stalks. "The Ironborn are in the Drunkard's Tower and the Gatehouse Tower. And sometimes they are in their own bellies with rotgut and dried squid. They do not like frogs. They do not like lizard lions. They do not like the earth beneath their feet changing its mind. None of that is their fault. They were born on knives and waves. The neck asks for patience, not daring." "Menshan. Patience we have," Robb said. "Daring too, and patience needs a knife." "Good," Howland answered simply, as if Robb had told him how many boots he wore. "We will make the place remember the old ways. We will cut paths only we see. Men you choose will go upon them at ours, I tell them. The rest will wait and be humble. The neck likes humble men." "Da." Roose inclined his head. "You will have men who do as they are told, because they enjoy the feeling when something sharp enters the right flesh the first time." "I will choose those men." Howland's mouth flickered. "I know those men in your house already. I want ones who also know how to leave meat uneaten when the hour is wrong." He turned to Robb again as to a god whose answer must be not loud, but exact. "If your grace can keep the proud from making marches when I say crawl, the earth will do much of the killing for you." Robb reached to scratch gray wind under the jaw where the fur was softest. "I can keep the proud. The hungry will be harder." "You feed the hungry with promises of killing later," Roose said. "It is a cheap meal, and it fills better than most." Howland nodded, whether at the words or at the way they were said. It was not certain. "Tonight," he said, "we will go see the Ironborn. They have made the Drunkard's Tower into a cup with holes. We will show them where the holes are and ask them to drink deeper. Do not send 1,000. Send 9 men." Roose had men ready before Reed had finished the sentence. He named them without raising his voice. A glover with long arms, 2 silent sisters orphan boys, who had become very loud with knives, a Hornwood man who used his left hand for almost everything, one of Mage Mormont's daughters with wrists like wire, and 3 of his own quietest who had learned in boyhood that dogs sleep most deeply when fed late. He asked Brynden Tully for the 9th, because he liked to let a riverman prove himself in mud. The Blackfish grunted assent, and chose one of his archers, who looked like someone's brother, and moved like someone's cat. Cailin came when she should not have, and stood with her cloak pulled to her ears, and the rain making a pattern upon it like a net. "There will be songs about this if it goes wrong," she said to Roose without turning her face from the fog. "There are always songs," Roose answered. "They cost nothing to those who sing them and everything to those they are about. I prefer accounts." Her mouth made a line like the edge of a script that a novice has taken too long to learn. "You have saved us once." "I have saved myself once," Roose said. And for a moment something that might have been feeling passed through his eyes, though it could have been only the reflection of a moving torch. It happened to be the same thing. "Pray that it continues so." "Pray," she said, as if the word were one she had heard 1,000 times and had never found a way to hold properly. "If you like," he said. The 9 went out as Howland Reed had said they would, and the land closed behind them like a wet mouth. Those left listened until listening turned on itself and became a buzz that makes men twitch. Brynden Tully sat on a stone and sharpened the same knife over and over again, the way one scratches an itch that has moved 3 times already. Rosalind Frey, sitting near a small brazier as if it were an altar, counted breaths 4 and 4 and 4 again, until she remembered the count from another hour and pressed her knuckles into her teeth to keep that hour from becoming this one. Edmure stood and sat and stood and sat, and then finally did neither and let the rain fall on him. Near midnight the mist unrolled a little, perhaps because it had grown bored with its own secrecy. The 9 came back as if they had always been here, and a story had only made it seem otherwise. 2 were wet to the waist, which was only interesting because the ground here could be wetter. 1 was bleeding from a part of the scalp that men do not notice until their palms are slick. The Mormont woman had something in a sack that dripped black into the reed mud. It went as a belly goes when you laugh too hard, Howland said mildly, stepping from behind them as if he had been the 10th all along. It spilled. They have lost 7 without knowing which 7 because they cannot count properly when their feet are not sure. They will drink more to make the earth stand still. They will be worse at counting. In 2 nights more we can take the drunkard's tower and keep it. Or we can leave it and take the gatehouse first, and then they will notice the drunkard when it is the only friend they have left. The gatehouse is a bud that will open to fire. Nander. What did you bring? Brendan asked, jerking his chin at the sack. The Mormont woman opened it without ceremony. A man's hand fell out, and then the arm, and then the shoulder to the socket where something had chewed. The smell was of salt and old leather. They are hungry, she said. We fed them mud for a meal instead. They did not like the taste. How many hold the towers? Robb asked, eyes on the hand, because it was easier than eyes on the girl who had brought it. Enough, Howland said. Never count numbers in the neck. Count mistakes. They have more? They made a long, quiet war. It was the kind Roose Bolton liked. A war of hours that had no names and men who forgot where their boots ended and the earth began. The Crannogmen did most of the seeing. The North did most of the waiting. Twice, Ironborn sallied at hours that were poor for it, and found themselves trying to stand upon green water that had been content a moment before to be land. Once, an Ironborn lordling with a beard like a scrub brush, and a face like a fist strode out upon the causeway with 6 behind him, and bellowed for Robb Stark to come down and be made a necklace for the drowned god. Robb did not go down. He sent arrows instead, and the lordling raised his shield and laughed until an arrow came from a direction that did not exist and entered at his ear. Howland Reed did not laugh. He simply blinked slower, as if satisfied that the neck was remembering itself. On the 3rd night, when the fog wrapped men so gently they forgot for a time that they were separate, they took the drunkard's tower without a cry. The Ironborn inside died like men who had slept, and those that lived woke to a world that did not know their names. By morning, a direwolf banner stirred where a salt kraken had spat and frayed. This did not make the air smell any better, but men breathed it more deeply. The gatehouse was harder. The Ironborn there remembered for a little while that they had been born to hold narrow things and choke them with their bodies. They hammered and sang and made boasts that reached the reeds and startled birds into damp flights. In the end, what undid them was not a sword, but a deciding of wind and the placement of fire where water thought to be. Howland Reed's children, cousins and friends who had become the same, slid little pots under the stones and left them like seeds. At the hour Reed counted upon, he touched flame to a reed that led nowhere for those who did not count, and in the time it takes to speak a simple prayer and lose your place, the gatehouse gave a hiccup and a set of stones removed themselves from the business of supporting others. Men fell. A door that had held since a different age turned ashamedly in its frame. Brynden Tully went through it with a dozen, and came out red to the elbows, and smiling the way men smile at a fight that has paid them back some old debt. When it was done, Roose stood upon the broken stairs and looked south along the causeway that had unspooled death toward them for a generation, and now belonged to them as if it had always done so. He had mud to the knee and old blood dried upon his cuff like palm velvet. He breathed, once, as if the air here had finally accepted him. "This is yours," he said to Robb, gesturing at the ruin that had been a wall. "The neck will hold for you so long as you hold the neck. Do nothing grand here. Leave that for others and their songs. We will make a great plain thing of this and live." Then Robb put his palm on the stone as if it were a dog's head. "We will make men pay for each foot of it," he said, not as a boast but as a promise to a child he had fathered and now meant to raise. Cailin came to them with her cloak soaked and her hair a wet river on her shoulders. She put one hand on the wall and closed her eyes and said no prayer aloud. When she opened them, she seemed thinner and calmer, as women sometimes do after a birth or a burial. "The Riverlands," she said quietly. "My father's home." Roose had already counted that cost. "Brynden will go," he said. "With 300 who know what a hedge is for. He will not try to break any gates. He will pinch and starve and make the men in gold hear frogs until their sleep drowns them. Edmure will not go. He will learn to be a husband for a little while." "Then?" Edmure flared, and then looked at his hands and saw they were not as steady as he would like. "I am a lord and a Tully and a poor husband to begin with," he said, as if the three things were a single curse. "You would have me sit while my uncle bleeds. I would have you live where you might breed," Roose said. "Not unkindly, and not kindly either. River Run is a stone and a river, and a grave, and a granary and the past. Your wife is the future, and I am not a poet." Caitlin's eyes flashed, and then cooled. "It would be something to keep a Tully child safe in the north," she said. "Something my father would not have thought possible, when he took me south to a marriage I did not ask for." "Your father did well," Roose said, and the words had none of the honey some men smear upon such sentences. "He married the Riverlands wisely, and he made himself a man who could be trusted to know when he was not a king." Brynden Tully spat over the edge into a tangle of reed heads that had somehow climbed the wall. "I will go," he said. "I do not like the way Lannisters sleep. It's too much like cats. I prefer to wake them and see if the back arches." He looked to Robb. "With your leave." "You have it," Robb said. "We will send ravens to River Run to let them know the blackfish swims still and bites." He turned to Roose. "And Ramsay?" "He is a knife on a table," Roose replied. "Within reach. Within sight. Better than in a hand you cannot see." He measured the boy who would have to hold that knife one day when the light was worse and the room more crowded. "I will use him at Moat Cailin upon the men who have not yet learned what patience is. There are iron-born pockets we have not emptied because their noise pleases us. Ramsay will do the mopping. He will feel useful. He will be watched." Caitlin's mouth had that line again. "Keeps dogs on a short lead, my lord. They reach as far as their teeth measure otherwise." "They do," Roose agreed. "And they remember every hand that kept them hungry. I am good at feeding a dog just enough." The work of making the neck into what Roose had promised was not work to boast of, and that made it the right sort. Men built low palisades upon ground that shifted and learned the smell that meant you would sink if you took one step more. They set poles at intervals that the crannogmen told them, and those poles were not for banners, but for counting and for not losing your way. They dug pits that water loved, and then disguised them with a miser's care. And then they marked those places with signs only they knew. A bent reed, a stone sunk 2 knuckles deeper than its neighbors. They made the causeway a throat, and put their fingers upon it. A messenger out of the south, who did not know where to place his heel, found his horse kneeling to a god that had no name, and the earth happily taking both gifts without complaint. Wyman Manderley's men appeared the way fat men surprise you, by how quickly they can climb stairs. They did not come as white mermen carved upon green, but as sailors with bellies and hands and knives. They brought salted eels in barrels and stories in their mouths, and those were as valuable if for different hours. Roose read it in their posture that their lord had made them answer to him first, which is the proper way of things. He read too that they were not displeased to be here. Men who have lived long beside tides do not object to mud that will stay put for the length of a battle. "White Harbor is yours," Roose told Robb when the first lading was counted. "As much as it can be any man's. Wyman will sit upon his chair and make puns and ask for songs about how large he is, and then he will count beans and men and ships, and give you those that bring him nearer to whatever he calls home. He will not die for you if he can live for his house. That is enough." "Dendero." Robb put his thumb to a barrel rim and tasted the salt there and looked thoughtful. "It will do," he said. "We will not be kings who ask old men to die to prove a point. We will ask them to live to make dinners. Just so," Roose said, and for a moment brief as a candle's flutter. There was a companionship in the air between them that would have surprised any man who had only ever seen Roose with a knife. The phrase did make a little pursuit, as Roose had predicted. Late, wet, purposeful, in the way of men who are ashamed, and do not know yet whether they should be more ashamed to run or to fight. They came with spears held too high for reeds and too low for fog, and they put their boots into places their grandfathers had been told not to put them. The neck did not rise in outrage. It simply accepted and redistributed them, with the quiet of water moving around a log. Half went home in twos and threes, and their mouths made stories that did not match the men who had also gone home. Walder Frey heard them all and slapped a boy once so hard that the sound made a flute break in the hall. Black Walder stood behind him with his fists closed, and saw for the first time that an old man's fury is not the same as an old man's plan. At Casterly Rock, candles made Tywin Lannister's hair into a crown that his son wore without ever feeling it cut. The old man read 3 letters in silence. The first from Walder Frey, full of reasons that boiled over and made a crust around the edge. The second from a cousin in the west who had used 3 words too many to say there was no dust on the road. The third from a man in a red cloak who had thought himself clever until he had put ink to parchment and discovered that cleverness is a thinner thing when you have to make it into lines. Tywin weighed the letters with the same care he might have weighed 3 knives to decide which would hold its edge longest. Walder is useless, he said to no one in particular and to everyone in his house. Ass are most old men who believe themselves the cleverest in any room. It is not their cleverness that undoes them. It is their surprise at being contradicted by the world. He put the letters aside. The boy is not dead. The wolf lives. It would have been clean. We will live with Messi. Kevin Lannister, who had never needed more than a plain sentence for his purposes, nodded. We can still starve them. We can starve anyone, Tywin said. We will starve ourselves if that is the way to carry the day. The neck grows food men do not wish to eat and feeds men who do not need to march far to hurt you. I do not like the neck. He rubbed a thumb along the edge of one of his own rings. We will make the Riverlands into a tray again. We will pile troubles upon it and bring it to the boy and ask him to be a king and a porter together. He will find his hands are not big enough. Then, Cersei asked if it mattered that the Freys were humiliated. If they feel small, they will bite harder, she said, as if she had kept dogs. Tywin did not bother to correct her. If they feel small, they will ask me to make them large. I will do so where it suits me, and let them think it was their own growing. Tell Joffrey there will be no grand wedding yet. He is a boy who likes a crowd. This is not the hour for crowds. The boy king in the north has friends who will kill more easily when they are not watched. Then? News rides along crooked lines no man draws. It found Sandor Clegane and Arya Stark in a hedge on a morning full of flies. The hound had a cut along his jaw that looked like a smile someone had sewn on, and Arya had changed in a way that made it difficult for men to know what to call her, except perhaps trouble and perhaps girl, when they were certain they had an ally. They had come to the twins and found not a song, but a smell and a road full of men who had already decided they had seen too much and would not see more if they could help it. They say the wolf got out, one said when Sandor lifted him by the collar without preface and shook the night out of him. Wolves run. Sandor said neutrally, as if testing the taste of a simple truth on his tongue. They say a pale lord told them how to walk through walls, the man continued, eager to be useful in the way of men lifted by the neck. They say the old one in there choked on his own spit. Arya listened with her head to one side, like a bird trying to see past a window into a room. She did not believe in pale lords who walked through walls. She believed in doors that are unlocked because someone turned the key when no one was looking. She believed in her mother being in a place without knives. She did not ask the hound to go to that place. She simply began to walk north. He swore and went with her because he understood that there are some very small bodies that make a kind of weather in the world. At Moat Cailin the work continued because the work is always the point when one intends to survive long enough to have an ending. The dire wolf banner over the broken gatehouse became a habit to the eyes. Men learned which frogs were safe to spear, and which were gods in small brown bodies. The rain grew thin, and then heavy, and then thin again, and then one morning failed to arrive, and the sky had a color nobody could immediately name. There were days when Robb thought like a boy again, and leaned against Grey Wind's warmth, and spoke of taking back Winterfell. With 10 men and a plan, he drew on the dirt with a stick. There were days when he counted boots, and expected no end to the counting. On one of the latter, Cailin brought Rosalind to him and said, in that tone that makes men remember which house they were born into, "She is with child." Edmure blushed not like a boy, but like a man who has found himself still capable of being surprised by the world, in a good way. He put his hand upon his wife's shoulder, as if terrified of the feel of bone under skin, and delighted by it at once. Rosalind cried. She had a way of crying that was very quiet, and made men look away, out of respect, so that she could have the privacy of her tears. Cailin watched her with an expression that might have been astonishment, had she been anyone but herself. "Walder will make this into a prayer and a curse," she said. "We will make it into a child." Roose did not smile. "Children are good walls. If they are his, he will see himself inside your house. If they are hers, she will see herself inside yours. Either way, one owes the other work. Which is better than love?" North of the neck, beyond the green trickery, the burned stones of Winterfell were cooling under a grey wind that had nothing to do with a wolf. Ravens came and went with news and lies in both claws. Ramsay Snow read what pertained to him, and laughed again. That fox bark that made dogs more attentive, and men less. He went about the business Roose had given him with the application of a man who believes he is auditioning for something larger. He took a dozen little men who had sworn to the wrong neighbor, and found that he could make them into examples without killing them. He liked the way fear remained useful when it is not sated. He sent 3 Ironborn to their god with the courtesy proper to foreigners, and kept 2 to learn the smell of Dreadfort cages. He wrote to his father in short words, "I did as you asked. I can do more. It fits me." Roose read those words one night by the light of a lamp that gave one no room for lies, and had them in his mouth for a moment as if he were testing their weight, to see if anyone was heavier than it should be. He put the letter aside and did not burn it. He had stopped burning certain things for a while. It is good to have evidence of what you already know when it is time to show it to someone who would prefer not to be shown. Brynden Tully's work in the Riverlands grew into the kind of rumor that never comes from songs. Men whispered that he had been seen at a ford and at a mill at the same hour, that he could teach arrows to swim, that he had taken dinner with a septon and left him with his tongue in a different shape. What he actually did was meaner. He found men with old grievances against Lannister men who had stolen hens and daughters, and he gave them an order that lined up properly with their resentments. He cut lines of supply that were only a little guarded, and let the well-guarded lines grow fat and proud and obvious by comparison. He made 6 garrisons in 6 villages, write letters home explaining why they could not spare a single man for Riverrun, even though it would be the right thing for their honor. Letters are glue. Once you have written them, you are attached to the reasons you invented. Every few nights a raven came back to the neck with a scrap of Brynden's success pinned to its leg. Robb read them with a smile that did not much reach his eyes, because the boy already knew what 100 such small victories meant. 100 men breathing tomorrow who would not have done if the Blackfish had chosen to be dramatic instead of exact. He sent back bread, salt, and permission to be meaner still. The Riverlands learned the difference between being at war and being stubborn. The Lannisters learned the difference between owning maps and owning roads. After a fortnight, a Frey banner appeared south of the causeway, with a white strip tied to its spear as if it wished to be a pretty girl. It was borne by a boy with poor whiskers and a jaw that had been broken badly enough the first time to teach him nothing. He called out that Lord Walder desired to talk as neighbor to neighbor, as ally to ally. Roose sent Mage Mormont, because men like the boy's grandfather felt more discomfort when a woman did not seem inclined to laugh at them. "Tell your lord," Meg said, scratching beneath her leather the way bears do, and spitting as if she had found a piece of grit that offended her, "that he is welcome to talk, and that the neck talks back. Tell him the talk will be slow and fair, and that if he wishes to speed it, the mud will eat his shoes. Tell him to bring bread and salt and a mouth that can keep a promise. Tell him that if he does not bring any of those, the neck will bring him a frog to kiss." "Now." The boy had no answer, because he had expected either complicated oaths or a knife. He rode back as badly as he had ridden in. A week later a different banner came and no white strip with it, and after 3 exchanges of excellent arrows, it withdrew and the reeds closed again over what had to be said. Nights at Moat Cailin took on a sameness that men who live to be old remember as a kind of glory. The frogs sang. Men sharpened blades they had sharpened yesterday and would sharpen tomorrow. Small quarrels broke out and were allowed to finish themselves the way a river finishes a point of land. Slowly, with the old shape remembered in the new one, Roose walked as he had in his tent on a different river and took measure of men when they did not know he was measuring. He knew the weight of their silence and the value of their jests. He kept a little bowl of leeches even here, because there are places in men that must be bled regardless of weather. And he found that crannogmen, who are wise about water in all its forms, had a respect for such creatures that men from stone places did not. Once, a child of Reed's folk came to watch with eyes that were older than his teeth. Roose let him look. "What do they eat?" the boy asked finally. "Bad humors," Roose said. The boy nodded as if Roose had given him a map, and then went away. On a morning that had too much blue in it to be wise, a raven from White Harbor brought Wyman Manderley's own hand upon parchment, the color of bread. He wrote with flourishes that had been born beside fine meals and old houses. But under the flourishes there was the count of barrels, ships, knives, and men. He mentioned a singer who had passed through with a tale of a boy king at a wedding, and he made a joke at his own table. He did not ask for anything yet. Roose folded the letter carefully and gave it to Rob, who read it and laughed a little at the joke, because he understood that jokes are a coin too, and if a man offers you one, you should take it and see what you can buy with it later. "I will go to White Harbor for a day," Rob said then to his mother, and to Roose and to the heir. "To be seen, to make promises with my own mouth, not a raven's, to stand before the men who feed my soldiers and let them decide whether they like the height of me." "Then, you will not go alone," Cailin said, all the fear and wisdom of a mother in the single word alone. "No," Rob answered. "I will go with guards who do not look like guards. We will call it a visit to old friends and make it into a crown when their wives tell the tale." "And in your absence?" Roose asked softly. This was not a challenge, only a set of weights being put upon a scale. "In my absence," Rob said, "you will be the winter that walks the wall." He looked full at Roose without flinching. "You have earned that trust." Roose did not change expression. Trust was a word he did not use even in his own head. It was a place where men liked to sleep and be robbed. But he inclined his head the exact angle a servant does when he has decided to be a lord on another day. "I will hold," he said. "I will send Brynden what he needs and no more, so that he is not tempted to spend it on pride. I will let the Freys come close enough to smell our cooking and then give them nothing. I will count the leeches and the knives." "Bah!" Rob smiled without showing teeth. "Do that," he said. "And if I do not return in 7 days, count me dead, and make of the neck a tomb so deep, they will never find their way past it. I make this a king's order so that no one will say one day that you stole my war from me." "Bah!" Caitlin's breath caught at that, and she reached to touch her son's sleeve, because mothers' hands measure the truth of their boys' vows. He did return. White Harbor made a feast of it, because White Harbor makes a feast where it can. It is a city that has learned that food is a language and the only one some men respect. Wyman spoke prettily and counted better. He pledged ships not now, but when Ice and Lannister both allowed it. Pledged gold not to be poured out of a chest, but to be weighed into 1,000 hands. Pledged men who could row as far as they needed to, and no farther, so that they would be where they had to be on the hour you prayed for them. Rob left with his head full of numbers, and his heart steadied by being looked at not as a boy, but as a kind of hearth men wish to sit near. When he crossed back into the mist the second time, he felt taller and colder, which are both good ways for a king to feel. In the days that followed, the neck became a machine with many slow wheels. Ravens went and came with the small regularity of a heartbeat. Ramsay sent 3 ironborn banners folded into a single rag and the ink-sour words. "I cut out their tongues as a kindness." Roose sent back 4 words: "Do not grow bored." Ramsay laughed at that and did not grow bored, which is as much as any man can ask who has ever tried to keep a vicious dog content. Walder Frey stopped sending boys and started sending men with gray in their beards. They did not carry white strips. Walder had decided that the sight of surrender offended him even as a jest. But they came with bargains pinned to their teeth. One day, they offered tolls. The next, they offered daughters who were not cousins, and dowries that made even Manderley's cooks look up from their onions. Roose received them all in a wet cloak and a clean face, and gave them back small answers that could be read 4 ways and added up to patience. "The neck likes humble men," Howland had said. Roose adopted humility as a mannerism, the way another man might adopt a sash. Bryndon's ravens brought a new name into the work: Sir Davin Lannister, who had been sent to make the Riverlands sit like a dog before its master's table. Davin did not sit, and he did not bark either. He was too plain a man for that, and too proud in the way of men who have not been spoiled by their pride. He gathered men by doing the simple thing you said you would do, and then doing it again. He did not overreach. He began to make a net that was less about catching fish than about making fish tire of swimming. Bryndon answered with little cuts on the net's knots. "This is a war I might enjoy if I were not so old," he wrote once. He did not mean enjoyment as a pleasure. He meant the satisfaction of a craft learned and still practiced with hands that had not forgotten how calluses are formed. The news of Joffrey's wedding came to them not from a raven, but from a Manderley sailor whose cousin's wife's brother-in-law had polished a certain column in a certain hall in King's Landing, and had boasted of it in a wine shop to a whore who had told the sailor for a pinch of cloves. It is astonishing where kingship is seen and spoken of. The man likely put his hand upon a stone pillar and believed himself inside history. He was, which is only to say that history will take you whether you offer or no. The whore had named a pie and a song and a necklace. Roose listened, and for once said nothing, because there was nothing to be said, until it had been said by a more proper mouth. When the raven followed a week later with better spelling and worse handwriting, he folded it the same way he folded the sailor's gossip, and put both into the same place in his head. "You do not smile," Cailin said, watching him watching the letters. "No," Roose said. "Smiling is for men who may have overcounted their luck. We will see whether a woman's pride has killed a king or a cook's hand has done so. Either way, the South will be busy with its own cleverness for a month. We will not be clever. We will be here. Then shall." Robb's hands curled once into fists and then opened. "There is a moment," he said, mostly to himself and the wolf, "when a house kills itself from inside and calls it victory. Most houses die that way," Roose said. "The rest die because the world is not impressed by their banners. We will try to be neither. Then, sin." On an afternoon that smelled of pennywort and metal, Arya Stark walked into the edge of camp with Sandor Clegane 3 paces behind her, and 10 paces ahead of any man who would have told them no, if he had known who they were. She was thinner and full of hard angles, and the look on her face was the look of a girl who has decided that she will accept the world's blows, so long as she is allowed to return some of them with change. Grey Wind saw her first and made a sound in his chest that could have been a threat until men noticed that wolves have names for their own. Caitlin made no sound at all. It is a hard thing to write the next breath of a woman whose child comes back to her from a pile of hours that would have killed a less stubborn creature. She took Arya in with her hands and her mouth, and then with her eyes, which is how a mother confirms what her flesh has told her. She thanked no god out loud. She kissed no ring. She took her daughter and then turned and saw Sandor, and the look she gave him had enough knives in it to dress a stag. "I brought her," the hound said, as if he were explaining to a hedge why he had crossed it. "I can take my pay in meat and a place to sleep where no one sings." "You will have both," Robb said, and it was the mark of his kingship that he said it as easily as if he had always meant to do this for this man. "And if you drink, do it where my men do not need to smell it." Sandor gave a bark that might have been a laugh, and might have been an insult. "Smell will be the least of your troubles here, Pupkin." Arya's eyes found Roose with the speed of a person who has learned to find the danger first. She did not flinch. "You had pale eyes at the twins," she said, testing a knife's sharpness with a thumb. "I have them everywhere," Roose answered. "It keeps me consistent." She did not smile. He would not have liked her for it if she had. She turned back to her mother and said a list of names under her breath that no one pretended not to hear. That night, she slept between Cailin and a wall, and did not wake until morning with a knife in her hand, which is a kind of peace. The neck held. It is not a dramatic sentence, but it is the one that matters. Winter crept down from places where even Roose's pragmatism acknowledged it as a god. The reeds hardened at their tips. The frogs sang shorter songs. The men learned to keep their hands inside their sleeves longer, and to piss in places where the steam would not announce them. The Freys sent fewer men and more paper. The Lannisters sent more men and fewer ideas. Brynden wrote less often because he had less to say, and the things he had to say were heavier. Edmure started 3 letters and finished one, and then tore it, and then wrote another, and gave it to Rosalind to read. She cried but less, and he did not have to look away anymore. One night, when even the torches seemed to shiver, Roose lay with his eyes open upon a cot that had the taste of old smoke, and counted. He counted men who would die in 2 years, and men who would live long enough to become inconvenient. He counted how much blood the North would spend to sit in the silence it had always claimed as its own. He counted how many children could be begotten upon this new peace he was inviting by refusing to be clever. He thought of Ramsay and his leash. He thought of Tywin and his patience. He thought of Robb and his youth, and he thought of Caitlyn's hands and the way they had taken back a daughter without trembling. He pictured the Dreadfort, its stones and its stairs that kept their secrets if kept properly. He pictured Winterfell, blackened and ashamed, wanting to be what it had been. In the morning he rose before the light and found Howland Reed sitting upon a stone with his knees hugged up in a child's posture, that in him looked like a priest's. They did not speak for a time. The fog moved in little rehearsals. "This place," Roose said at last, so softly that even the mist had to lean in. "It suits me. It suits men who do not require an audience," Howland replied. "And it suits men who know that all ground is a kind of water if you wait long enough." Roose inclined his head. "The Freys will tire. The Lannisters will grow bored with trying to strangle a swamp." "Now, they will," Howland said. "Bored men are dangerous if they are clever, and nothing at all if they are not." "Tywin is clever," Roose said. "He will turn his cleverness upon his own house when the outer world gives him less purchase." Howland smiled in the way reeds smile, when you have not looked at them for a while, and then you look back and see a village. "Then perhaps we will be left to our frogs." Roose thought of the bowl of leeches. "Perhaps," he said. He did not believe in perhaps as a plan. He believed in counting. When the first snowflake fell in the neck that autumn, it did not stay long. It turned into water in the palm of a manderly man who held it up and called it by the wrong name. Men laughed because this is what men do when they have time. Roose stood and watched one of his quietest men teach a Frey envoy how to step without sinking. He kept his voice level. He made no songs. He kept the weather he had chosen as if it were a garment he would be buried in, and he intended that his house, his king, and this ruin-turned wall would all be standing when the stories men told later looked toward songs and found themselves failing at it and having to settle for accounts. The first true frost came on the back of a wind from places that had forgotten summer centuries ago, a breath that rasped reeds into brittle strings and set men's teeth against one another, as if some quarrel had been rejoined in their skulls. The neck accepted it with the same courtesy it offered heat and rain. It made mud harder, turned trickle to skin, and taught boots to creak when they would rather have sighed. The direwolf banner over the gatehouse did not stir any prouder in the new cold. It merely moved as it had been taught to move by a lord's hand and a tether. Roose Bolton liked frost. It put an edge on his thoughts the way a whetstone puts an edge on steel. Slowly, with patience for failure, he rose before the sun, which in these weeks was the same as saying he rose in darkness, and walked the parapets as if he had been born to count them. Men slept in folds of wool in anger. and the soft misery that comes when you have done a day's work and know you will be doing it again tomorrow. He found their names where they had left them, on the backs of knives, in the laps of cloaks, scratched with boot tips upon frozen mud. He touched none of them. He had need of men's names when they were awake and foolish. It was good to leave them where they slept. 3 days after the first frost, a boat came sliding through fog that had gathered its skirts tight, carrying a woman who handled the pole as if it were a sword she had worn since girlhood. She had a face that only a mother could love, if the mother had been very stern. Mira Reed's hair clung in ropes to a hood. Her eyes were like the shallow places where boys become men learning how to swim without drowning. Howland Reed followed in another boat, with a boy who wore thoughts like a garment that did not fit him yet, though he had the posture of someone who would grow into anything if given the hour. Roose recognized in Jojen the look of a child who had been told a story and ordered, by the story, not by any mouth, to accept it as a map. "Old God send you," Robb told Howland, and then looked properly at the boy and girl and the way they stood in the boats. "And young ones, if any answer here." "They do not," Mira said kindly enough. "But they watch, and that is sometimes almost as good." Jojen's mouth had a pale rose's curve and its fragility. "The water dreams at night," he said. "It is a hard thing to tell a king what water whispers." Roose tucked those words where he tucked all things he could not weigh yet. "Tell him anyway. The worst a king suffers by hearing is delay." "Then?" Jojen looked at him and blinked once, as if the sight of Roose's stillness had required a second try. "North," he said at last. "Not yet. Not all, but soon. There is a cold that is too clean to be simply weather. The wildlings make a noise like a river breaking out in spring, but there is something behind their voices that is not a voice. And winter and ghosts," Brynden Tully said, making an impatient sound as if shooing a fly. "There's always a boy who sees further than his boots. The question is whether the boots reach the place he is telling you of." "Then how far do your boots reach, Lord Bolton?" Mira asked, turning her head to give him courtesy as if it were a weapon, and she wished to make sure it had not rusted. "As far as my king commands," Roose answered. "As far as the frogs will have me. As far as common sense permits a man to go without a song to excuse the trip if he returns empty-handed." "Now," Howland Reed made a low sound that could have been amusement or winter. "Sense is not common. We keep it in jars here and lend it out to those who ask with clean hands." He looked past Robb, toward the places where the reeds thickened and made their own horizon. "Send men to the wall, because the wall asked, not because you believe you will be thanked. Send food because hungry men with bowstrings are worse than enemies. Send no banners. The cold likes banners." Roose watched Robb weigh that. The boy had learned to sit very still, while the part of him that was not a boy spoke. "We will send men," Robb said. "I will send Mormont spears because they know the smell of snow as well as blood. I will send 300 and a promise of more if they like the way we keep our word. You will get word back that the world is larger than your banners." Howland said, not unkindly, "You will see whether that pleases you." Cailin said nothing until the boats had slid back into their element. Then, 300 is not a kingdom, Robb. It is when the wall falls," Roose said, because it was better for the boy to hear a cold truth in a cold man's mouth. "Men who mean to be kings only where their feet touch are never kings for long. Send them." Mage Mormont took the 300 as if they had been hers from the hour she first shouted. Her daughters scowled with the proper measure of envy. "Deep wood must be taught its manners as well," she said. "My sister knows its trees too intimately to let Ironborn piss on them without comment. Asha Greyjoy has made a stout little stink there." "Asha Greyjoy will make a bargain if we ask for one that does not shame her," Roose answered. "But if we shame her, she will rather die proud than live sensible. We will try her sense first. Failing that, we will take her pride and make it into ale." "Women are not barrels," Mage said, amused enough to let him have the figure. "We will see what she is made of. I will go to the wall with my own hands. Daisy will take 100 to Deepwood with Lady Barbary's barrow men and 10 of Lord Wayman's fattest who can walk without wheezing too much. Bannon? Lady Barbary will want to be asked twice, Cailin murmured. Ask once too kind, and once as if your patience has been tasted. She respects both. Roose had asked her already by Raven in the tone one uses to invite a woman to steal something with you. The reply had been short and salt-lean. I will come with men who remember why we love bones. He liked Barbary Dustin because she did not disguise her grief as appetite. She had learned to feed both with equal thrift. Before the Mormonts left for the wall, Arya came to Mage with her hair roughly pulled back and her knife in her belt. Take me, she said. I want to see where my uncle's house begins. It begins at every stream that runs to the sea, Mage told her. And at the wall that is not a wall so much as a story. You will see enough here. Learn the weight of your hand before you ask it to carry snow. I know the weight of my hand, Arya said, which was true and not the whole truth. She knew its weight bearing knives and stones and bread, and her own chin. She had not yet learned its weight holding the wrist of another child until both stopped shaking. That is a lesson the world gives out only in certain rooms at certain hours. Sandor Clegane took his meat, his sleep, and his insolence, and offered very little in return, except that Arya was not dead, and that sometimes when men shouted and drank too near her, he appeared beside them with the expression of someone about to swat a fly with a smith's hammer. Roose spoke to him once, briefly. You do not like kings, he said. I do not like boys, Sandor replied. Keep not liking them, Roose told him. It can be useful. Sandor made a sound as if spitting without spitting. You're the sort who would use a man to peel an apple. I am the sort who uses the sharpest thing at hand to do the thing that must be done without bruising the fruit, more than we intend, Roose said. Be sharp. The first snow that stayed came 2 weeks later, in a fine dust that made men's cloaks look as if they had been forgotten at the back of a widow's wardrobe. It collected in the crooks of spears and the corners of mouths. It found its way under leather and softened it, and then made it crack. In that weather, a fray party attempted to make a demonstration of injury that might force a conversation. They came with trumpets that sounded like men with bad lungs, and a lot of banners for men with so few ideas. Roose watched them from the broken teeth of the wall and kept the men beside him quiet until the sound of the trumpets began to offend him on principle. Then he gestured once, and the arches of the reed-choked ditch opened like old mouths. It is an unnerving thing to watch a horse with a good opinion of itself discover that the world can be water where it expected earth. The phrase broke, because men who come to lecture marshland are not built to learn in the middle of their sentence. And the reeds closed behind them, as if they had been a bad dream. No one cheered. Roose would not allow it. He let the quiet sit with the men instead. Toward Deepwood, Daisy Mormont and Lady Barbary took their 130 through the pine-hung hills, like a mean winter moving with its mind made up. They made no songs. They spoke little. They cut a path where Ironborn had made messes, cleaned up after them, as a mother cleans up a child old enough to be ashamed. The pines closed in, and the snow came heavier under their boughs. At night, the women of Bear Island told rude stories about krakens in bed. The Barrowlands men sat and listened to the trees list the dead. They came upon Deepwood's palisade in a day that had been cut short at noon, and found Asha Greyjoy's banners hanging damp and patient, 2 ravens roosting upon the crest poles, as if they belonged to her and not to any god. Scouts reported her people steady and short on oats. They had salt enough to dry meat and temper enough to salt words, but their eyes were tired in the way eyes get, when they cannot look far without seeing only trees. Daisy sent a boy in with a strip of linen on a spear and a message that Lady Barbary had written herself. Come out and lose, or come out and talk. If you stay in, you will eat wood. Asha came. She had a face like Balin's made clever, and a way of holding her head like someone measuring doors. She wore mail fell to her thigh, and a black cloak with a fringe of something that might have once been fur, and was now a memory. She left her axe at her side because she was not stupid. She brought 3 behind her, and left 20 watching along the palisade. Daisy met her with the relaxed weight of a woman who did not need to prove she could break bones. Lady Barbary stood beside her with a hood that made her face a blade-shaped thing, and a mouth that never quite settled upon frown or smile. You have not come to kneel, Barbary said. I kneel for no man who drowned to please a god that cannot be bothered to go where the water is truly cold. Asha said. I have come to be told whether you are selling sense. If you are, I have come with coin. Give me Deepwood, and you may walk out with your men and your fingers, Daisy said. Bring your axes if you like. We have no use for them. We have use for your hands elsewhere. Nam? You will not take us to Winterfell and hang us, Asha said, not quite a question. We will not take you to Winterfell and hang you, Barbary replied. Your father made mistakes. You make fewer. We do not punish people for their fathers on this side of the neck, unless the fathers were intent on making their sons into a lesson. Behi. Asha measured that, and measured the 130, and the way the Barrowlands men held their spears, as if they had been born with them, instead of christened with them. She measured Daisy's wrists. She measured, too, the silence of the trees, which do not favor salt. I have 140 in there, she said, counting 3 men down with fever and 1 child born here to a girl who spits when I tell her to go back to the Isles, because she says she likes the way snow makes her brave. Bring them, Daisy said. Bring the child. Bring the girl if she wants to see what weirwoods look like when they tell the truth. Men, let me keep my banner, Asha said. A man without a banner is a mouth without a tongue. Keep it, Barbary said, and her smile, when it came, was a small, feral thing. Your banner will mean something when you are dead only to men who like the color. Keep your men alive, and the banner is a cloth to dry your hair. Bendshau. Asha went in. She came out an hour later with the child under an Ironborn boy's cloak, and her men in a line that had the look of defeat and composure together. She gave Daisy her hand to seal what the words had been, and Lady Barbary watched their fingers touch with the attention of a woman counting stitches. You'll taste the inside of a prison if you lie, Daisy warned, friendly as a bear making a joke. We keep them cold, so you'll feel at home. I'll taste worse if I allow you to spend my men on my father's pride, Asha said. I am done eating what he cooked. They marched Asha's men south with them, not bound, not armed more than a fist or a jaw, and sent 3 ravens ahead to Roose that said only, Done. Asha Greyjoy has sense. She should be watched when she is warm. When the party reached the neck, Asha squinted at the reeds and muttered something in her own tongue that was not a prayer. She looked at Roose the way a cat looks at a chair before deciding if it will leap. Died. You are the pale one, she said. The one who counted. I'm a man who keeps accounts, Roose answered. You are the one who stopped a war by deciding you were born with a head. I am the one who stopped feeding my men my father, Asha said. Where will you keep me? In a place where you can hear the frogs and tell me when their songs change, Roose said. In a place where your men can work and learn to pull their feet out of mud without swearing. Will you send a letter to Pike? She asked. Or will you wait for the sea to send you one of its own? The sea will send me a letter, Roose said. It usually does, and it is usually short. 2 words at most. He's dead. Or wait longer. Men say that about my father, Asha replied. Men say a lot about my father. She looked to the black water in the ditches, tasting its name. Men will say a lot about you. I hope they keep it to themselves, Roose said. I prefer billing to gossip. A raven came within 6 days with an answer that was not ink. It brought only a feather from some other bird stuck in its wet black, and the way it shook like something that had flown against a window in a storm. Another came 2 days after, and bore a strip of sail the color of hunger. Wyman Manderley sent words. The sea mutters of a king fallen from a bridge. I am told Euron called Crow's Eye returns with an oar and a grin. I am told there will be a king's moot. I am told lies. I will sell him beer salted enough to keep him thirsty. Roose folded the Manderley letter with an inward placing of things. He went to Robb with it. The boy read and looked up, and the line of his mouth had changed quietly over the last month, into a mouth that knew things tasted different depending upon whether you put them on a man's tongue or a kingdom's. The sea eats its own, he said. We will not stand close enough to feed it. We can use those who step back from the edge, Roose said. Asha Greyjoy is such. The rest will test the color of water. Then? Robb stroked gray wind without looking down. How many of my days will be spent counting men who will drown themselves without my help? As many as it takes to keep the men you can save from learning how to drown from them." Roose replied. "You are a king. It is mostly arithmetic." Nemderwai. Arya came to the wall late that afternoon in a cloak that had once been Bran's and now belonged to whoever fought for it. She stood without speaking for a long time, while Roose weighed parchment in his fingers and boys weighed swords in their thoughts. At last she said, "I want to see Winterfell again." "You will," Roose said. "When?" she asked flatly, taking comfort in the inability of a single syllable to betray what she wanted from it. "When the ground is right and the air is sharp," he said. "When the snakes in the corners have been counted. When the men who think they own it have learned not to say so out loud." "You mean Ironborn," Arya said. "Or someone worse." "There are always men worse than those you have named," Roose said. "The trick is to keep their names out of your room until you have sharpened the right knife." She watched him with those gray eyes that made men's mouths confirm the truth against their will. "My mother trusts you," she said. "Your mother trusts the weather she can see," Roose answered. "It happens to be the one I have chosen." The ravens from the wall came in with frost on their claws, and the smell of smoke that was not from hearths. Men read them, and grew thinner at once. Crows do not do embroidery with their news. There were numbers of fires, counts of horns, names of sentries, dead and enemy alive. Jon Snow's name inked only once with a hand that had forgotten whether to claim him as bastard or as part of the North's breath. The words used for Mance were respect and fear and arithmetic. Someone had written, "We have barrels of pitch and 100 bad ideas. We will use both." Robb sent a rider after Mage to tell her that more were coming. He chose men from Serwyn and Talhart, and 24 from White Harbor who had walked boats in winter, and knew what it meant to do hard things with ropes in their hands. Roose approved the list, crossed out 3, added 5 of his own whose names meant little to any man but himself. "They will keep," he said when Robb raised an eyebrow at the addition, "and they will not die in ways that make songs." "Do you mean to go north yourself?" Cailin asked him later, in the tone of a woman who would like to compel an answer when she knows she cannot. "No," Roose said. "I mean to keep the neck from discovering how thin it can be made before it breaks." She nodded, because there is something to be said for one man doing his own work while another does his. "Winterfell," she said again, and the word sounded like a stone dropped carefully into a frozen pond. Roose set Winterfell like a figure on his mental board and measured all the fingers reaching toward it. Ironborn who wanted to claim burning as revenge and called it duty. Men of the Barrowlands and White Harbor who wanted to clean the place because its dirt offended their fathers. Freys who wanted to squat somewhere northern so that their sneers would seem like weather and not insult. Ramsay Snow who wanted to squip so he could be sharper. The boy king whose bones would not. He weighed too the cost of walking the king through snow, to stand in a ruin, and the cost of leaving that ruin, unimproved through a winter that promised to be mean. Wyman Manderley's letter solved a part of it. He wrote that he had 3 barges of masons and a team of 300 men who could carry stone and not complain out loud as long as they were allowed to complain to one another. He had timber that had not been so long in shipbellies as to taste of brine. He had a cousin who could remember where the books had been stored in Winterfell before the fires, and thought what hadn't burned might yet be coaxed out of cellars if men were careful and not proud. He asked for nothing but a place to set their pot, and a word that the king in the north liked pies. "He will send the pies regardless," Roose told Robb, giving him the letter. "It is his way of letting men know he can afford to feed them. Accept them. Feed them to men who do not think you care whether they eat." "We will go to Winterfell," Robb said. "We will go carefully. We will walk the walls as if they were old friends who are hard of hearing. We will not demand. We will ask. And we will let Wyman build us a roof while we sleep outdoors like truthful men." Nender. Roose put things in motion that did not creak when they moved. He sent Ramsay Snow south and west with 100 to do the mopping he had promised him. And he yoked to that 102 of Barbary Dustin's old uglies who hated everyone equally and knew all the roads men might forget in rain. He wrote to White Harbor with a list as exact as any housewife's, and ended the letter with a request for a child's toy in the shape of a wolf, a thing that would please Arya and remind Wyman that sometimes kings are boys, and sometimes those boys have sisters. He sent letters to Lady Anya Waynwood and Sir Helman Tallheart's widow that said nothing a raven would blush to carry, and everything a woman who has kept a house in winter would weigh properly. He sent a quiet letter to Harrion Karstark at Carhold, addressed to him as if he were not hostage but lord, and the words in it did not mention Richard nor crime nor father. They mentioned snow and hunger and men's names who had died for Karstark honor when the honor had been poorly wielded. They mentioned magnanimity as a tool of war. It was a letter that could be read aloud to proud men by a proud son without shame. Harrion did not answer at once, but the second raven sent returned with empty cords, and that was an answer too. By the time they were ready to move, the days had compacted to a stingy handful of light, and men's breaths looked honest in the air. They left a spine of steel at Moat Cailin, and took the king up the old road toward Winterfell, with a guard that changed its eyes every mile. Caitlin rode wrapped in a cloak that had been thickened by mother's hands. Arya wore brands again. Roose kept the van as before, and he kept his quiet, and he kept the worry of every man who wished to see what Winterfell would make of them. The first sight of the castle struck men into believing in ghosts. The towers had a hunkered way about them, black against a sky that was only a lighter black. The crook where roofs had burned and been left to fail had a color like old liver. The gatehouse sulked. Smoke rose from between stones where it had no right to be rising, unless some blackened place below had decided to give out the last of what had been left it. When the gates were opened after much knocking and counting, and the display of the direwolf banner, the smell came out. Old ash and older piss, and a sadness that had not learned to harden in time for winter. There were men and women within who had refused to leave because the idea of leaving the bones of their fathers behind made their feet dumb. There were dogs who had learned unpleasant new ways to gain food. There were ravens who had built nests where men's tables had once been. The weirwood and the godswood watched them come with the patient attention of a thing that had been watching since men began to speak. Its leaves were the wrong color for a day like this. They should have been blood, and instead they were some other red that no one had a word for that did not imply murder. Robb dismounted and stood with his hand on Grey Wind's neck and looked at the walls, and then at the ground, and then at the walls again. He did not cry. If he cried later, it would not have been Roose's business. He listened to the stones. They had learned to speak more softly in the last year, but they spoke. Caitlin walked into the godswood as if not of her own will. Arya went after her, nearly at a run, and then slowed, remembering, and then quickened again, because there are things you must run toward. Wyman's men came in with their ropes and their hammers and their gruff talk of angles. They moved as if they had learned that work done well is a kind of song that keeps out the cold. They had brought 2 small looms and 3 women who knew how to dress stone against future weather. In the cellars there were 4 charred shapes that had once been shelves and could be convinced to be shelves again if a man was patient enough with wood that had reason to be shy. Down in a vault that had stayed dry by good fortune and old work, there was a crate of books tied up in twine that had last been touched by a hand that wore ink. Caitlin herself pulled them out and laid them on a table that had 3 legs left. She wept a little over those books and then laughed, like a woman who had feared she would never again have anything proper to dust. Roose went room to room. He did not speak unless spoken to. He lifted his hand to a lintel and pressed the pads of his fingers there, as if a man could wake a place gently by asking polite questions of the wood. He looked into one room that had been spared and saw, hanging on the wall, a child's carving of a wolf, rough around the ears, with a scar of gouge where an impatient slip had taken off too much wood. He let his hand hover beneath it without touching, then dropped it, and closed the door. Ramsay arrived as the second day ended, with his 100 and the 2 Barrowlands men who did not have names in any common song. His face had a high, unmoved color from the cold, and his eyes shone when he saw Winterfell, not as a ruin but as a game board. He bowed to Robb with a grace that sat on him like a borrowed cloak. "I have made 100 little deaths in the last fortnight," he said to Roose when Robb had gone to stand a while at the edge of the kitchens where heat lives even in wreckage. "They do not sing. You would approve. I approve only of results, Roose said. I approve most of men who do not demand to be praised for them. I do not demand, Ramsay said. I enjoy. He smiled, and the smile was made of thin things. Shall I mop here? You will help Wyman's men to secure the lower arches of the East Tower first, Roose said. There is a crack like a lie. It must be filled. After, you will go with Lady Barbary to hunt down 3 men who have refused to leave their fires for the work. You will persuade them politely. Then how? Ramsay's head tilted, the way a dog's ear does when it hears a note that has no business being in its world. Politely. Politely, Roose repeated. Remember that we are making a house. Doors are not knives. Ramsay bowed again and left. And the 2 nameless Barrowlands men went with him, their faces as unreadable as rain on stone. That night Roose stood with Cailin in the Godswood while she told the weirwood about the things it had missed. Small things, as if she had formed a habit of catching the large ones and letting the little drip through her fingers. Arya knelt without kneeling. Children have ways of folding themselves that make a lie of posture, and whispered names to the roots. Roose looked up at the red leaves and thought, not for the first time, that gods who listen at trees have a better chance of learning what men are than gods who demand gold. He did not kneel. He bowed his head out of courtesy, because even a man who does not love an altar may, if he is not a fool, take off his hat before he walks into another man's church in a storm. They made a sleeping hall in the great keep, where the roof was least an accomplice to winter. They hung blankets where doors had been. They put women together for warmth and men in lines that could be counted at dawn. Robb refused a bed that was not a pallet near the door. Grey wind lay before him, and when men came too close, the wolf raised his head and showed them the white handicraft of his teeth, and then lay it down again, because a good guard is mostly quiet. In the morning, a raven brought news. It came with the way ravens come when the news is simple and large, and will change something in a room even before men read it. It had flown through a snow that had made its feathers act like knives. It let itself be unburdened like a man who prefers facts to heavy pockets. The ribbon was from the south, the hand from King's Landing or near it, the words written carefully by someone who had learned to write careful for fear of mistakes. Joffrey Baratheon, it said, King, had died at his wedding feast. There were words like choking and purple, and the sort of euphemisms men think help when they do not wish to write poison. There were other names: Tyrion, accused; Sansa, fled; Tywin, silent but not still; Marjorie, a word that looked like pity beside a string of praise. There was the phrase, Hand of the King, and the name beneath it was not Tywin but his. Roose handed the letter to Robb. He watched the boy's face as one watches a fire, not to learn what it has become, but to remember what it can do next. Robb did not smile. He did not move. He looked at Grey Wind, and Grey Wind did not move either. The wheel turns, Cailin said at last, softly, an old prayer in her voice, though she forgot to pray most days and did not trust the gods to be clever. The wheel turns and breaks those under it, and those who think themselves the axle, Roose said. We will not crow. No, Robb answered. We will not crow. We will not march south. We will not be tempted to use their noise to make our own. We will finish this roof. We will finish our stores. We will thicken the neck until it is a belt around a fat man. We will send more to the wall. And we will keep Brynden fed with lies and knives. Roose nodded. The Lannisters will fight themselves politely for a while, and we will let them. A polite fight is better for us than a loud one. Meanwhile, Walder Frey will send ravens to both sides telling them he always intended something else. He will talk so much, he will drown. See that he is given chances to speak. Man? He wrote to Wyman Manderley that night, and thanked him for pies. He asked him, as if incidentally, whether any singers had recently been seen in White Harbor telling stories about knives and goblets. He asked him, as if casually, whether any ship of unusual name and unlovely captain had come in with 2 eyes in one head and one in another. Wyman wrote back with lists of flour and salt and timber, and at the bottom of the page there was a line that might have been a joke. Sometimes a fish chokes on a bone. Perhaps it choked itself. He signed it with a drawl that somehow managed to exist on parchment. Roose folded it and put it away. The days made themselves into work, which is what they do when men have decided to live more quietly than their own rage allows. Winterfell learned to shelter again. Masons cursed softly and politely when stones misbehaved. Women learned where the drafts liked to travel and set their beds along warmer routes. Children who had refused to laugh since fire burned began to take careful risks with small giggles. Arya rode out each morning with 3 Mormont women and came back with knees that had learned new names for balance. She put her hand upon the crypt door once and looked at Roose, and he said nothing. So she pushed it and the dark held. She went down and came up again, and did not tell anyone whether she had cried. Men do not need to know such things. Gods do. Asha Greyjoy and her men were set to work under Wyman's foreman. They learned to carry stone. They learned to carry it without thinking about the insult of carrying stone for a house that had broken them. They learned to eat stew that was not fish. Asha stood sometimes on the wall and looked toward a sea she could not see, and did not ask to be given a boat. She asked for news and was given it when there was any that would not unbalance her into treachery. She asked once for a book and Cailin gave her one that had been singed on 2 edges, but still told its story. Asha read slowly, careful of the ink, like a woman handling a thin blade that had once been her father's. Ramsay, kept busy, did not put his hands upon men who did not need his hands upon them, because the Barrowlands uglies watched him with interest, and they were not the sort to forget who had asked them to lunge. He killed 3 men in the woods who had been helping themselves to other men's bundles and called it thinning. He flayed no one. Roose checked, by means that would have been called unlovely if men had enough breath to complain. Brynden Tully sent a letter in a hand that had grown rough since last they had read him. He had taken 4 mills on the Mummers Ford and burned them so that Harroway's towns must come to Riverrun hat in hand and ask for flour. He had cut lines between the Golden Tooth and Maidenpool, so that Sir Davin must choose whether to feed men or arm them. He had stolen 3 dozen arrows out of a Lannister wagon and left in their place 36 reeds tied with blue twine. He wrote, "There is a patience in me I had not expected. If I live, I will be surprised at the amount of my life that was not wasted staring at boys who thought themselves heroes." Roose wrote back, "Heroes are the first to die of hunger. Keep stealing." He sent 2 sacks of dried eels and 6 jars of Thompson mustard, and a letter to Harroway's town that said only, "Remember who fed you last winter. Forget who will demand thanks next spring." He attached to it an old story his maester had written down years ago about a lord who had tried to live by eating only compliments. The lord had died of good opinion. From the wall, a raven of a different bearing came with a king's name on its tongue. Stannis Baratheon had come to the aid of Castle Black at the hour when men either become songs or stones. He had brought fire and banners with a burning heart that set some men's mouths to arguing and others to saving their breath. He had beaten Mansraider back with iron and prayer and obstinacy. He asked, the raven said, for the North's fealty to the one true king, for men and food and a stoop of common sense. He asked with the voice of a man who had never asked for anything, and did not distinguish between asking and commanding. Robb read it, and smiled that not smile that had learned to sit on his face when he was too careful to give anyone else hopes a meal. "He is a hard man," he said. "He has done a hard thing for us. He asks me to bend knee to him. He asks you to recognize what he believes is already true," Roose said. "He asks you for men to fight your war for you." "It is the same war," Catelyn said, with the simplicity of a woman who has looked at a wall until she no longer needs to persuade herself that walls matter. "It is," Roose replied. "And it is not." He considered a moment. "Send him food. Send him men. Send him gratitude. Send him a letter that says a king in the north owes another king only the aid princes give princes against the night. Do not send him your knee. He will win or lose without it." "He will be offended," Catelyn warned. "He is always offended," Roose said. "It is his way of keeping warm." Robb penned the letter himself. He did not write well. He wrote like a boy who had become a king quickly and had not had time for scrolls. He wrote of his father, and of the wall, and of cold that did not care for crowns. He wrote that the North remembered old words and kept new ones. He sealed it with a wolf for a king, and sent it to the wall with men who did not talk about politics because they did not need to. Men at the wall seldom do. When the first roof was mended, they made a small feast of it. Wyman Manderley had a pig, cooked in a way that made men believe the sea could not spoil everything it touched. He had a pie with tiny wolves cut out upon its crust, and another with eels squirming fancifully, and men laughed at that more than the cook had intended because laughter needs something to rest upon. Asha Greyjoy ate a slice and did not frown. Ramsay ate too, and said nothing. Arya smiled with her mouth closed, and took a third to the woman who had let her sleep near the hearth the week she had arrived, without questions. Cailin drank warm spiced wine, and watched her son walk among men, and put his hand upon shoulders, and say their names. Roose stood with Barbary Dustin and Howland Reed near a brazier that had been set by the wall to keep the stone from sulking. "You have made yourself a winter," Barbary told him. "I have made myself a house," Roose said. The winter was already on its way. Howland looked toward the north with that amphibious calm of his. "The wall will ask again," he said. "The heart that burns on Stannis cloth will ask again. You will answer again." "We will answer as those who intend to have a spring," Roose said. "Not as those who wish to spend all their heat in one long bright night." Barbary's mouth curled into something that had little kindness in it and much admiration for a certain kind of economy. "Walder will die soon," she said. "From spittle or spleen." "He is already dead," Roose said. "He is merely counting out loud until someone interrupts." "Who comes after?" Howland asked. "Men with worse teeth and better appetites," Roose answered. "Those are sometimes easier to starve." They did not sleep easy. No one does in a castle that has learned ghosts. They slept. In the morning the frost had drawn lace on the inside of windows. Men had argued over mending. In the morning, someone's breath had frozen on the expulsion and fallen to the floor as ice. In the morning, a Frey raven came with words about Walder's health and an invitation to speak at a place that was neither Twins nor Crossroads, some farming village whose name made it sound bigger than it would be. Roose took the raven into his hand and held its head in his fingers and felt the very small heartbeat thrumming there. He released it. He wrote, "Speak to yourself and send it back without a proper address." They found a cache in the crypts of salt pork that had managed to mummify itself cleverly, and a little chest of rings that had not been buried with their owners because of men's sins or fear. Cailin ordered the rings melted and made into nails, and 3 men were offended, and then convinced of the nail necessity when the new roof refused wind. There is a kind of piety that is merely bone-deep thrift. On a day of strange blue, a rider came from the west with the banner of House Blackwood. Its ravens crossed snarling around a tree that had less blood than it deserved. He brought the news that Raventree had been harried by brackens under Lannister's smile, and had held. But there were dead men with honest hands, and 3 boys who needed a king's touch to convince them that they were to become men, and not fodder. Robb sent back a letter written with his palm pressing too hard, and his promises measured correctly, and a bag of salt because salt is how men hold on where rivers try to loosen fingers. That night, as if the world had decided to give them balance by its own arithmetic, another raven came with the first true news of Tyrion Lannister's escape and Tywin's death upon a privy. The letter had been written by someone who loved the queen, or hated her enough to write as if loving, and the shape of the words had the strain of someone trying to carry a bucket through a crowd without losing any water. It was a kind of poor poetry. The facts under the words sat like stones. Joffrey dead, Tywin dead, Tommen a boy with a crown, and a mother with a wolf's hunger and no forest, Iron Throne now an argument with legs. Catelyn read it and put it down and pressed the base of her palm to the bridge of her nose, as if to remind her head that it was a part of her body, and not merely a carrier of other people's sorrows. "It would be easy to take comfort in this," she said. "It would be foolish," Roose said. "They will be busy, which helps us. They will be angrier than usual, which helps no one." Robb nodded as if he had already learned the lesson, and was grateful to be relieved of the duty to forget it. "We keep to our work," he said. "We keep the neck. We keep the wall fed. We keep the Riverlands clever. We keep Winterfell standing, even if standing is all it can manage this year." "None," Roose looked at him and found himself, rarely for him, in possession of a feeling he might have named if naming feelings had been his habit. It was not pride. Pride asks for applause. It was nearer to satisfaction. He let it lie where it came to rest and did not poke it. By midwinter, the men in Winterfell had learned the helpful routes through the lower halls where the wind did not reach as often as elsewhere, and where women had left small braided lengths of straw over doorways to invite luck without superstition. The kitchens had a pattern that could be seen in the air even before one entered, a rhythm of knives and ladles that made the room's heartbeat. The yard had a track around it beaten clean enough to serve for boys' races. Arya beat 2 boys older than her, and then lost to a girl smaller than her by a hair, and laughed properly for the first time anyone outside her family had seen. It sounded like the sort of thing men live for. Roose walked the wall every day and counted. He counted the barrels, salted beef, flour, oats, salt fish, eels, wine, the manderly luxuries that arrived even in winter, jars that contained small homilies written in Wyman's round hand, and were read to men at night by a voice that suited sermons better than war. He counted the men who took sick, who shook it off, who used sickness as a chance to be weak, who refused to use sickness at all and died because of it. He counted the knives because knives make different shapes in different hands, and he liked to note potential. He counted the moments Robb remembered to praise the right man, not the loud man. He counted the times Caitlin's eyes went to the god's wood and the times they stayed in the hall, when a child cried because its milk was too cold, when deep winter was a fact, not using ink but blood. Men came from the wall with news that the others were quiet, which is the kind of news that tells a careful man to be less sure than he wishes to be. They brought harder news. Stannis Baratheon had made camp at the crook of the King's Road with fewer men than comfort would ask, and more banners than his pride would call for. He had sent south for grain, and it had moved north as fast as men with money and bellies take anything anywhere. He had punished a man for theft with a severity that some applauded and others feared because they had stolen small things to live, and did not call it theft in their heads. He had married a Frey daughter to a sellsword to make a point. He had made many points and few friends. Robb's letter back to him was weighed even more carefully than before. He wrote, "We will send you grain, for a king who stands at the cold edge beside our brothers is a man who will not be refused bread by us. We will send you men, because winter cannot be fought by hunger. We will send you nothing of our crown but respect, for we are what we are, and will be so until spring looks us in the eye." It was a king's answer written by a boy who had become a king without time to practice. It was impressive for its simplicity. It told Stannis everything and nothing. It promised common sense and demanded it in return. Ravens do not carry sighs, but if they did, Stannis Bird would have returned wheezing. Freys tried once more. Not with banners or trumpets or boys with torn mouths. Not with letters that left grease on the fingers. With knives placed poorly. They sent 3 men in winter cloaks into White Harbor with a bundle of rope and a plan to make a fire in a storehouse, and then blamed the boy who had fallen asleep on watch. Wyman's men found them because the men in his kitchen know the smell of bad lard. They were taken, not flayed, not broken, shown the storehouse with the firewood nicely stacked, and asked if it was really so hard to think of food as something more than a thing to boast about burning. They blustered. Wyman had them put to work frosting cakes until their hands shook too badly to do it well, and then had them swept out and sent to Barrington with a letter that said, "Either teach your men that pies feed more mouths than fires, or I will teach them here, and I will use them for the lesson." The men went home with sugar on their sleeves. Black Walder, reading the letter, bit his lip hard enough to bleed because he could not think of a good retort and hated the feeling. There was a day when the sky was so white it seemed the gods had painted over their mistakes and left the canvas blank in apology. On that day, Roose stood in the yard with Ramsay beside him. The younger man had a thin smile he had learned to wear when he wished to look docile and did not know the word. "You are not what they say," he told Roose, as if delivering a new discovery. "I am always what they say," Roose answered. What matters is what I am also. Ramsay turned that over in his mouth like a seed that might sprout. You have kept me, he said. You have not used me as a blade you throw away after you have cut one throat. Blades you throw away after one cut are poor work, Roose said. You will do many cuts. Some will be to meat. Some will be to rope. A man who only knows how to cut meat is a butcher. A man who only knows how to cut rope is a sailor. A man who knows the difference is a lord. Nemtal. Ramsay's smile broke, and for an instant Roose saw something like longing beneath the part of the face that had learned to be cruel to keep a different cruelty from being done to it. Then the face resumed. And after, he asked, when the wall is quiet and the phrase are a story, and Tywin is in the ground, and men have grown fat and stupid again? What will you be after? Besimda. What I am always, Roose answered. Alive, counting. Ramsay laughed. Alive is a good thing to be. Do not get bored, Roose said. Bored men become stupid, and stupid men make loud mistakes and have the wrong sort of songs told about them. Ramsay licked his lips thoughtfully, like a man tasting a new spice. I will make quiet mistakes then. Roose let the silence sit between them until Ramsay went away to find something useful to do with his hands. By the time winter had reached its middle and decided to take its time with the rest, Winterfell had acquired the beginnings of a habit again. The men who had come with Wyman had discovered which of the girls in the lower town had smiles that worked like flint and which had smiles that worked like cream. Marriages were not made, that is for spring, but promises were placed in small boxes in several houses to be opened when roads thinned enough to let a parson through. Asha Greyjoy slept better. Lady Barbary Dustin sharpened the edges of her politeness until they cut. Howland Reed vanished as easily as fog and appeared again as if the Reeds had found they could move and had decided to walk into the yard beside him. Arya practiced with a stick and then with a small sword and learned that range is not a metaphor, but a number. Cailin found a room where, if you sat just right, your back got warm and your feet did not freeze, and the world's order seemed as plain as a housewife's list. Robb learned how to keep a room quiet by not speaking and make it loud by speaking one sentence. Roose watched the work and made adjustments. He took 3 knives away from men who did not deserve them and gave each a shovel. He gave a knife back to a woman who had earned it with one long day, spent saving a boy from a fever that had wanted to learn him better. He sent a quiet man south with a quiet letter for Lord Glover, asking about lumber that had been promised last year, and offering to forget the promise if Glover would instead send him a list of the men in his holding who were too proud to be useful. Glover sent back both lumber and a list with 6 names on it, and an apology that he had raised boys to be loud when the Times asked for listening. He asked the king's pardon and received it without a speech. Sometimes at night, Roose lay awake and listened to the castle breathe, and he thought of the twins in the song that would not now be sung in the way men had intended, with the certainty that world schemes often feel before the world corrects them. He thought of Walder and Tywin and Stannis and Wyman, of boys in black on a wall rattling with frost, of girls in pines and boys in reeds, of dead men under trees, who would not speak even to those who loved them best. He thought of his leeches, and the way a bowl of small mouths could be a more reliable court than any hall of applauding men. He thought too of Arya Stark, whose knife had not yet learned her name properly, and of Robb, whose crown had and who wore it now like a man with a load to carry, not a boy playing at king. On one such night, he rose and went to the window and stood without a cloak. The cold spoke with a clean grammar. He allowed it to articulate him. Below, in the yard, a single figure crossed between shadow and light, with the grace of a cat and the attention of a soldier. Roose recognized the posture. Arya, returning from some errand that had pleased no one but herself. She moved to the Godswood and disappeared under the black arms. He waited and watched, and neither she nor he were troubled by the other's watchfulness. When she came back, she stood for a moment in the center of the yard and looked up at the sky, where the stars had been taught to flare in this part of the world, as if they anticipated darkness taking offense. She looked like the kind of girl who would one day stand in the middle of a room and name everyone in it by their proper word. He went back to his pallet and slept, the way stones sleep, without apology. When the thaw began, It did so not with warmth, but with unease. The mud returned, offended by its absence. The roads complained, and then pretended to be better. Men's boots made sounds like lies. Ravens brought news more easily. Freys sent apologies without the grease thick enough to make them slippery. Lannisters spoke of treaties, and the ink looked hopeful, and then despaired in the same line. Stannis sent gratitude that read like a reprimand. Manderly sent an invitation for the king to come eat and be seen by wives, who would say later they had known all along he would be a good one. Brynden sent a feather tied to a scrap of red cloth with a single word: patience. Asha sent nothing. She worked. Ramsay asked to take 100 more men and go hunting down the last of the Ironborn nests. Roose told him no, and sent Barbary with 50 instead. Ramsay took the refusal as if it were a cold cup offered politely by a man who did not intend to be moved. He smiled and did not argue. He pulled out a tooth that had been troubling him and laid it gently on the table between them. "I am getting better at knowing when to keep things quietly," he said. "You are getting better at not telling the world when you are bored," Roose said. "Keep doing that. It will not be needed forever. There will be other work more suited to your hands." Men. He did not tell Ramsay that the world has a way of creating jobs for men whose hands like to be busy. It was an indulgence Roose did not intend to offer the boy. He would keep him where he could be watched, and he would feed him just enough, as with dogs, to maintain attention. On the first day Robb walked the rebuilt stretch of wall from gatehouse to tower without having to hop a gap. Winterfell made a sound not unlike relief. It was a breath that belonged to stone more than to men. Cailin stood on the tower top and let the wind tangle her hair like a lover who had come back and promised to be kinder. Arya ran the length 3 times and won twice and laughed about losing once. Wyman declared that the pot could now hold another day's stew without letting it freeze at the edges. Howland Reed, who had come and gone as if the marsh had put on and taken off a robe, stood beneath the weirwood and touched it with his palm in the manner of a man who remembers promises. Roose stood at the gate and watched the yard fill with men and women and children who had been promised no feast and were given a short one anyway. He watched Robb speak 2 sentences that will not be written down and will be remembered anyway, because good sentences, like good walls, fit the place they were made to keep. There would be other winters and other wars and other men who believed they had found a path through both which would make them get to spring first. There would be songs that lied and accounts that were dismissed because they did not rhyme. There would be letters to write and letters to burn, and letters to fold and keep for a morning, when one might need to show a man what his own mouth had made him. There would be Ironborn who forgot their new manners and Freys who forgot their old failures, and Lannisters who discovered that wealth is a kind of ice if handled without gloves. There would be Stannis, always offended, always necessary. There would be a wall that would take the lives men sent it and do what it could with them. Make them into stories, into warnings, into bones beneath snow. Roose Bolton would count. He would measure, and he would put a bowl of leeches on a shelf, and take it down now and then, and make himself remember that all men carry more blood than they need. He would speak quietly, and make the castle breathe in that exact rhythm. He would stand behind a boy king, and make of that boy a man who believed patience could carry steel further than pride. He would make a winter weather he could live in, and he would teach his house to wear it. On a clear morning when the frost had retreated into ditches, and the sun came out like a guest who had overstayed and decided to help with the washing up, Roose walked once around the inside of Winterfell's walls. He paused at each corner and looked down into the yards where life was proving itself again by making small noises. He looked toward the godswood and thought about how men put their trust into things that do not ask to be trusted. He looked toward the road and thought about how roads rarely return favors, but often accept them. Robb joined him at the gate. He said nothing at first, which was the right amount of words. Gray Wind's head pushed into the space between them, and carried in it the smell of something that had been hunted and not eaten yet. At last, Robb said, "Thank you." Roose did not ask for what. He knew what. He inclined his head. "You will be thanked by others," he said. "Do not keep any of it in your pockets too long. It spoils. Now." "My father told me once to be humble," Robb said. Humility is not a coin, Roose answered. It is a habit, like sharpening knives and washing hands. Do it when no one is watching, and you will not cut yourself when men are watching. Robb laughed softly, genuine. You always sound as if you have already counted the breath I am going to take. I try to spend it well, Roose said. A man came running then, with a look that did not belong to anyone who had been sent to summon boys for soup. He had the stretched eyes of someone who had seen the future approaching, and had not had time to make it into a story. A rider, he said, winded from the wall. He carries a cloak with a red heart that burns. He says the king asks audience. Them? End. Robb looked at Roose and then at the sky, and then at the wall, and then at his own hands, as if testing their weight for new work. Let him in, Roose said, and give him something hot to drink. Men who have ridden far deserve heat before being asked for words. They stood waiting while the gate worked its way open. The cold came in with the man, and the man came in with the cold, stamping, his beard set with white, his eyes overbright in the way of men who have taught their bodies to stay awake beyond sense. He knelt, and then stood, and tried again to be the right sort of figure for a message like the one he carried. He spoke Stannis' name and the walls. He spoke of a queen's men, of selling gods and buying others, of need that had learned to be dignified. He spoke of a march that would be made soon enough, whether the North liked it or not, against Boltons and Karstarks and Manderleys and Frees and Starks and Snow. He spoke it without a list, because men who have ridden through cold need lists to stay alive. What does your king ask? Robb said when the man had used up his first rush of words. For bread, the rider said. For men. For sense. For the truth. Robb nodded. He shall have the first two. He already has the third. I will share the fourth when he has time to listen. Then done. The rider blinked, because that was not how kings had answered him on the road, and because the wind had found his bone and was tapping it like a friend calling to be let in. He took the cup of hot set in his hands, and looked down into it as if there might be a god there, and didn't complain that there wasn't. He drank, and life returned to his mouth enough to ask for more bread, and the name of the cook. Roose watched everything, counting it into useful piles. He did not smile. He had no need. He had his weather and his house, and the work that winter asks of men who intend to be alive in spring. He had a king who had learned to carry silence properly. He had enemies with appetites that could be measured, and friends with appetites that could be fed. He had a bowl of leeches and a city of stone. It would do. That night he woke, not from any dream, but because sometimes sleep releases a man the way a dog decides to release a bone. He rose and went to the godswood. The weirwood's face watched him with a courtesy that no human would ever manage, interest without demand. He stood there until the cold completed its grammar in him again. He did not ask anything, and he did not offer anything. He allowed that a man may stand in a place and be marked by it, and that the mark may help him count. On his way back across the yard he passed Arya, who was doing the thing she had been told not to do by every mouth, and had learned to do anyway without being seen, walking the wall at the hour when all the guards had decided to believe that no child would be fool enough to walk a wall in that cold. She moved with a care that did not advertise itself. He paused, watched her cross a gap that had not yet been mended on the inside, watched the way she placed her foot on the one stone that still felt like stone and not an opinion. When she noticed him, she dipped her head. Not a curtsy, not a bow, just an acknowledgement that a pale man had seen a thing and would decide later what to do with it. Do not fall, he said softly. She almost smiled. I will not fall. You will one day, Roose said, but not from here. She sniffed and kept going, and he let her. In the great hall, Robb sat with Cailin and Wyman and Lady Barbary and Howland and half a dozen other heads of houses that had learned to fit together under the stone this winter, and they put bread and salt on the table and ate as if it were a plan. Roose took his place, not at the king's right. He was not a man who needed to be seen, but where his head could see the faces that mattered. The talk was not of glory. It was of doors that must be mended, of men who must be watched, of letters that must be written, and what they must not say. It was the talk that saves houses. It was his talk. He spoke when he had to. He listened always. He counted. And winter, which is only the world's way of testing whether men can keep their promises to stone, took note of him as a man worthy of the work.